The concept of Hyperborea first emerges from a myth of ancient Greek literature as a geographical and spiritual counterpoint to the known Mediterranean world. The earliest substantive reference appears in Hyades' fragmentary works from the 8th century BC, where this northern realm is presented not as a mere distant territory, but as a fundamental component of Greek cosmological understanding. Hesiod's treatment of Hyperborea establishes it as existing beyond the reach of Boreas, the fierce north wind that brought winter's harsh bite to the Greek peninsula. This positioning immediately signals that Hyperborea occupies a space outside normal meteorological patterns, suggesting a land where the natural laws governing the Mediterranean world cease to apply. In Hesiod's cosmogony, the world divides into distinct regions, each governed by different divine forces and natural principles. The poet's fragments indicate that Hyperborea represents the ultimate northern boundary of the inhabitable world, a place where the destructive power of Boreas cannot penetrate. This geographical immunity from a north wind's influence creates the foundational characteristic that would define Hyperborean mythology throughout subsequent Greek literature: its status as a realm of perpetual comfort and divine favor. Hesiod's treatment suggests that the Hyperboreans exist in a state of continuous spring untouched by the seasonal cycles that dominate Greek agricultural and social life. The etymological development of Hyperborea reveals the sophisticated meteorological understanding embedded in early Greek thought. The term combines hyper, meaning beyond or above, with boreas, the personified north wind who appears throughout Greek mythology as a powerful and often destructive force. Boreas himself occupies a central position in Greek meteorological mythology. Depicted as a winged deity capable of devastating ships, destroying crops, and bringing the killing frosts of winter. His realm extends across the northern regions known to the Greeks, encompassing the lands of Thrace and Scia, where harsh winters and violent storms originate. By positioning Hyperborea as existing beyond Boreas, Greek poets created a conceptual space that transcends normal climatic limitations. This etymological construction reflects a sophisticated understanding of wind patterns and seasonal weather systems. Ancient Greek observers recognized that harsh winter weather consistently arrived from northern directions, brought by cold winds that swept down from unknown regions beyond the Black Sea and the northern mountains. Boreas represented the personification of these destructive meteorological forces, and his mythological character embodied the unpredictable and often catastrophic nature of winter storms. The concept of a land existing beyond his reach therefore implied a region where the fundamental causes of seasonal hardship could not operate. Pindar's Olympic and Python, composed during the 5th century BC, provide the most detailed and influential descriptions of Hyperborean society that survive from classical antiquity. His 10th Python ode presents a vivid portrait of a civilization that exists in perfect harmony with divine will, enjoying privileges that remain forever beyond the reach of ordinary mortals. Pindar describes the Hyperboreans as living in a state of continuous festival where music, dancing, and religious celebration form the primary activities of daily life. Their cities resonate with the sound of lyres and flutes, while choruses of maidens perform sacred dances in honor of Apollo, who spends his winter months among them when he departs from his shrine at Delhi. The Hyperborean freedom from disease represents one of their most remarkable characteristics in Pindar's account. Unlike Mediterranean populations who faced regular outbreaks of plague, fever, and other ailments that could devastate entire communities, the Hyperboreans exist in perfect physical health throughout their extended lifespans. This immunity from illness connects directly to their spiritual purity and divine favor, suggesting the disease represents a consequence of moral corruption or divine displeasure rather than merely natural causes. Pindar's description implies that the Hyperboreans maintain such perfect religious observance and moral conduct that the gods shield them from the physical sufferings that afflict other human populations. Their legendary 1,000-year lifespans further emphasize their exceptional status within the human condition. Pindar presents these extended lives not as mere biological anomalies, but as rewards for their perfect piety and continuous devotion to Apollo. The Hyperboreans spend these centuries in uninterrupted happiness, free from the anxiety about death that haunts ordinary mortals. Their longevity allows them to accumulate vast wisdom and perfect their artistic and religious practices across multiple generations of normal human experience. This temporal advantage enables them to achieve levels of cultural sophistication and spiritual development that remain impossible for peoples constrained by typical human lifespans. Pindar's Hyperboreans inhabit a landscape of perpetual spring where flowers bloom continuously and fruit trees bear their bounty throughout the year. The absence of winter eliminates the agricultural anxieties that dominated Mediterranean life, where failed harvests could result in famine and social upheaval. Instead, the Hyperborean environment provides abundant sustenance without requiring the intensive labor that characterizes farming in seasonal climates. This agricultural ease allows the population to dedicate their time to artistic, religious, and intellectual pursuits rather than struggling for basic survival. The poet emphasizes that the Hyperboreans achieve their blessed condition through perfect religious observance, rather than through technological advancement or military conquest. Their society operates according to principles of harmony and mutual respect, guided by divine wisdom rather than human ambition. This moral foundation distinguishes them from the competitive and often violent civilizations of the Mediterranean world, where cities regularly engaged in warfare and political conflict. Pindar suggests that the Hyperboreans have transcended such destructive impulses through their spiritual development and divine connection. Early Greek poets consistently employed Hyperborea as a literary device to highlight the limitations and problems of contemporary Mediterranean civilizations. By presenting detailed descriptions of Hyperborean perfection, poets could critique existing social, political, and religious conditions without directly challenging powerful rulers or established institutions. The contrast between Hyperborean peace and Greek warfare, between Hyperborean health and Greek disease, between Hyperborean longevity and Greek mortality, serve to illuminate the shortcomings of actual human societies while maintaining the fiction of discussing a distant and mythical realm. This literary technique proved particularly effective because it avoided the political dangers inherent in direct social criticism, while still conveying pointed observations about contemporary conditions. Poets could describe Hyperborean freedom from tyranny without explicitly condemning specific rulers or praise Hyperborean religious purity without directly attacking corrupt priests or inadequate ritual practices. The mythical distance of Hyperborea provided a safe space for exploring alternative social arrangements and moral possibilities that might prove dangerous to discuss in more direct terms. The geographical positioning of Hyperborea also served important cosmological functions within Greek thought. By placing this perfect realm at the northern extremity of the world, poets reinforced the concept of geographical determinism that influenced much classical thinking about human societies. The idea that climate and location directly influenced human character and social development appears throughout Greek ethnographic writing. The northern peoples generally characterized as brave but lacking in sophistication, while southern populations were seen as intelligent but lacking in courage. Hyperborea represented an exception to these patterns, a northern region that combined the positive qualities associated with different geographical zones while avoiding their typical limitations. The relationship between Hyperborea and Apollo further reinforces its function as a literary contrast to Mediterranean realities. Apollo's annual journey to spend winter months among the Hyperboreans suggests that even the gods prefer their perfect society to the flawed civilizations of the known world. This divine endorsement validates Hyperborean superiority while implying criticism of Greek religious and social practices. If Apollo himself seeks refuge in Hyperborea during the harsh winter months, this suggests that Greek lands fail to provide adequate spiritual comfort even for their patron deities. The Hyperborean connection to Apollo also establishes important links between this mythical realm and Greek religious centers, particularly Delhi. Ancient sources describe Hyperborean embassies bringing sacred offerings to Apollo's shrine, creating a network of religious exchange that connects the perfect northern realm to actual Greek religious practices. These embassies serve multiple literary functions, providing opportunities for poets to describe Hyperborean customs and values while maintaining connections between the mythical realm and contemporary religious experience. The transition from purely mythological treatments of Hyperborea to more systematic historical inquiry begins with Herodotus of Hyrcanus, whose history is written around 440 BC, represents the first sustained attempt to examine Hyperborean traditions through the lens of empirical investigation. Unlike his poetic predecessors who presented Hyperborean accounts as established truth, Herodotus approached these traditions with a skeptical methodology that would define classical historiography. His treatment of Hyperborean material demonstrates the tension between inherited cultural beliefs and emerging standards of historical evidence that characterized 5th century Greek intellectual development. Herodotus dedicates substantial attention to the complex system of religious exchanges connecting Hyperborea to the sacred island of Delos, Apollo's birthplace, and one of the most important religious centers in the Greek world. According to his investigations, the Hyperboreans maintained regular contact with Mediterranean Greek communities through an elaborate chain of intermediary peoples who transported sacred offerings across vast distances. These offerings, wrapped in wheat straw, according to ancient custom, traveled through Scythian territories across the lands of various Thracian tribes and through multiple Greek city-states before reaching their final destination at Apollo's shrine on Dos. The historian describes how these sacred packages passed from the Hyperboreans to the Scythians who delivered them to their western neighbors. From there, the offerings continued westward through a succession of peoples, each group maintaining the religious obligation to transport the sacred materials to the next link in the chain. The Adriatic Eneti received the packages and passed them to the Corinthians who delivered them to the Dona region. From Dona, the offerings traveled south through Greek territories, reaching the Malian Gulf before being transported across the Euboea Sea to Charistus. The Christians then carried them to Tenos, and finally the tenants completed the journey by delivering the sacred materials to Do. This elaborate transportation network reveals sophisticated diplomatic and religious relationships extending across enormous geographical distances. Each participating people understood their role in maintaining the sacred connection between the distant Hyperboreans and Apollo's shrine, suggesting widespread recognition of Hyperborean religious authority throughout the northern regions. The system required consistent cooperation between numerous tribes and city-states, many of whom might otherwise maintain hostile relationships. The sacred nature of the Hyperborean offerings apparently provided sufficient motivation to overcome normal political boundaries and ethnic conflicts. Herodotus notes that the Dians themselves preserved detailed records of these exchanges, maintaining oral traditions that identified specific Hyperborean individuals who had participated in the offering system. The islanders spoke of 2 Hyperborean maidens, Opis and Arga, who had accompanied the first offerings to Dos in the distant past. These women had remained on the island where they died and received heroic honors from the local population. Their graves became focal points for Dian religious observances, with local women cutting their hair in tribute and young men dedicating their first beard trimmings at the tomb sites. The historian also records the story of two additional Hyperborean women, Hyperarche and Leotis, who had arrived at Dos accompanied by 5 men, known as Perfories. Unlike their predecessors, these individuals had come not merely as religious envoys, but as permanent settlers who established ongoing Hyperborean presence on the island. The Gens treated them with extraordinary reverence, providing them with positions of honor in religious ceremonies and ensuring their comfortable maintenance throughout their lives. When they died, the entire island participated in elaborate funeral rites that became annual commemorative festivals. These detailed Dian traditions provide Herodotus with concrete evidence for historical Hyperborean contact with the Greek world. Moving beyond purely mythological accounts to examine specific individuals and documented events, the precision of Dian record-keeping, including the preservation of personal names and specific burial locations, suggests that these exchanges represented historical realities rather than purely legendary material. The continuous nature of the offering system maintained across multiple generations indicates sustained diplomatic and religious relationships between Hyperborean communities and Mediterranean Greek populations. However, Herodotus expresses significant skepticism about the geographical claims associated with Hyperborean traditions. While acknowledging the cultural and religious evidence for Hyperborean contact with the Greek world, he questions the specific geographical descriptions found in earlier sources. His investigation of northern regions based on information gathered from sign informants and Greek colonists around the Black Sea fails to identify any territory matching traditional Hyperborean descriptions. The lands beyond Scythia, according to his sources, consist of harsh steppes inhabited by nomadic peoples living under difficult climatic conditions rather than the perpetual spring paradise described by Pindar and other poets. The historian's treatment of the famous Aberrus, the Hyperborean, demonstrates his methodological approach to evaluating extraordinary claims within historical frameworks. Multiple Greek sources preserve traditions about this remarkable individual who allegedly traveled throughout the Mediterranean world during the 7th century BC, carrying a golden arrow that served as both a magical implement and a symbol of his Hyperborean origins. Various accounts describe Darius as possessing supernatural powers, including the ability to travel vast distances without eating, to predict earthquakes and other natural disasters, and to purify cities afflicted by plague or other divine punishments. According to these traditions, Aberrus had received his golden arrow directly from Apollo during the god's residence in Hyperborea. This divine gift enabled him to travel through the air, covering enormous distances in remarkably short periods. Greek cities throughout the Mediterranean had reportedly welcomed Aberrus as a holy man capable of providing divine guidance and supernatural assistance. His arrival in various communities coincided with the resolution of serious problems, including the end of plague outbreaks, successful military campaigns, and the establishment of beneficial religious reforms. Herodotus acknowledges the widespread circulation of these Aberrus traditions while maintaining careful distance from their supernatural elements. His account focuses on the historical evidence for Aberrus's travels rather than the miraculous powers attributed to him. The historian notes that multiple Greek communities preserved records of visits from a northern holy man, claiming Hyperborean origins, suggesting that some individual matching Aris's basic description had indeed traveled throughout the Greek world during the specified period. The golden arrow associated with Abares receives particular attention in classical sources, with various authors providing different explanations for its significance and powers. Some traditions describe it as a divine gift from Apollo that enabled supernatural travel, while others suggest it served as a sacred implement used in religious ceremonies or divination practices. Certain accounts claim the arrow contained meteorological properties, allowing Aberrus to predict weather patterns and seasonal changes with extraordinary accuracy. This meteorological connection links back to fundamental Hyperborean characteristics, particularly their relationship with Boreas and their immunity from harsh weather conditions. Herodotus's investigation reveals that several Greek cities maintained temples or shrines associated with Abris's visits, suggesting that his influence on Mediterranean religious practices extended beyond temporary appearances. These permanent installations indicate that Greek communities found sufficient value in Abris's teachings or interventions to establish lasting commemorative structures. The historian notes that some of these shrines continue to receive offerings and maintain active religious functions centuries after Abaris's alleged lifetime, demonstrating the enduring impact of his supposed activities. The historian's skeptical approach to Hyperborean geography becomes more pronounced when he examines claims about the specific location and accessibility of Hyperborean territories. His extensive research into northern regions, conducted through interviews with Scian traders, Greek colonists, and various tribal representatives, fails to identify any area matching traditional Hyperborean descriptions. The lands beyond the Black Sea, according to his informants, consist primarily of harsh steppes where nomadic people struggle against severe winters and limited agricultural opportunities. Herodotus notes that even the Scians who inhabited the northernmost territories known to Mediterranean Greeks reported that the regions beyond their lands became increasingly inhospitable rather than more pleasant. Zithian accounts described vast wilderness areas where extreme cold made permanent settlement impossible, contradicting the traditional image of Hyperborea as a land of perpetual warmth and abundance. These geographical investigations lead the historian to question whether Hyperborea exists as a physical location accessible through normal travel, or whether it represents a spiritual or mythological concept that transcends ordinary geographical categories. The development of classical historiography following Herodotus demonstrates varying approaches to Hyperborean material among subsequent scholars. Diodora, Siculus writing during the 1st century BC, attempts to synthesize earlier Hyperborean traditions with contemporary geographical knowledge. His library of history presents Hyperborea as a real territory located beyond the Rhoetean mountains, inhabited by people who maintain the religious and cultural characteristics described in earlier sources, while existing within a more conventional geographical framework. Diodorus describes the Hyperboreans as inhabiting a large island in the Northern Ocean, roughly the size of Sicily, where the climate remains temperate throughout the year due to favorable winds and geographical protection from harsh weather systems. His account attempts to provide rational explanations for traditional Hyperborean characteristics, suggesting that their longevity results from excellent climate and abundant natural resources rather than divine intervention. The absence of disease among Hyperboreans, according to Diodorus, stems from their pure environment and healthy lifestyle rather than supernatural immunity. This rationalized approach to Hyperborean traditions reflects the influence of Hellenistic geographical and ethnographical studies, which sought to explain extraordinary cultural phenomena through natural causes rather than divine intervention. Diodorus incorporates contemporary knowledge about Northern European peoples, including Celtic and Germanic tribes, to create a more plausible framework for understanding Hyperborean society. His synthesis attempts to preserve the essential elements of Hyperborean traditions while making them compatible with emerging standards of geographical accuracy. Pliny the Elder's natural history, completed during the 1st century AD, represents the culmination of Roman attempts to systematize classical knowledge about distant peoples and territories. His treatment of Hyperion material demonstrates the challenges faced by ancient scholars attempting to reconcile inherited traditions with expanding geographical knowledge. Pliny acknowledges the authority of earlier sources while expressing reservations about specific claims that contradict contemporary understanding of northern regions. The Roman Encyclopedist notes that various Greek and Roman expeditions into northern territories had failed to encounter any peoples matching traditional Hyperborean descriptions. Roman military campaigns beyond the Danube, trade expeditions to the Baltic region, and diplomatic contacts with Germanic tribes have provided extensive information about Northern European populations without discovering communities possessing the extraordinary characteristics attributed to Hyperboreans. This accumulating evidence leads Pliny to suggest that Hyperborean traditions might preserve memories of ancient peoples who had since migrated to other regions or disappeared entirely. Pliny's analysis reflects the broader Roman approach to inherited Greek learning, which combined respect for classical authorities with practical skepticism based on contemporary experience. Roman administrators and military commanders had accumulated vast practical knowledge about European geography through conquest and colonization, providing empirical data that often contradicted traditional Greek accounts of distant regions. This tension between inherited learning and contemporary observation characterizes much Roman scholarship as authors attempted to reconcile respected classical sources with expanding practical knowledge. The classical historiographical tradition surrounding Hyperborea demonstrates the evolution of ancient approaches to evaluating extraordinary claims within historical frameworks. Early historians like Herodotus established methodological principles that distinguish between documented cultural traditions and unverifiable geographical claims, creating analytical frameworks that influence subsequent scholarly investigation. Later, historians built upon these foundations while incorporating new geographical knowledge and developing increasingly sophisticated approaches to evaluating inherited traditions. The mythological relationship between Apollo and Hyperborea represents one of the most complex and enduring elements of ancient Greek religious thought, establishing connections that transcended simple geographical boundaries to create a sophisticated theological framework linking divine presence with earthly perfection. Classical sources consistently describe Apollo's annual departure from his primary shrine at Delhi during the winter months, when the god travels northward to spend the harsh season among the Hyperboreans in their perpetually temperate realm. This cyclical journey establishes Hyperborea not merely as a distant territory mentioned in passing by ancient authors, but as an integral component of Apollo's divine nature and religious functions. The timing of Apollo's Hyperborean sojourn corresponds precisely with the period when his oracular activities at Delphi ceased, creating a direct correlation between the god's physical absence from Greece and the suspension of prophetic consultation at his most important Mediterranean sanctuary. During the 3 winter months when harsh weather made travel to Delhi difficult and agricultural activities came to a standstill throughout the Greek world, Apollo departed for the northern paradise where eternal spring provided an environment more suitable to his luminous nature. The Delphic priests acknowledged this divine absence by suspending oracular consultations and dedicating the winter months to Dionysus, whose chthonic associations made him more appropriate for presiding over the dark season. This theological arrangement reveals sophisticated Greek understanding of seasonal religious cycles and divine specialization. Apollo's association with light, music, prophecy, and civilized order made his presence most valuable during the productive months when human communities engaged in agriculture, trade, warfare, and other activities requiring divine guidance. His winter departure to Hyperborea allowed him to maintain his essential characteristics while avoiding the harsh conditions that contradicted his solar nature. The Hyperborean climate permanently maintained the ideal temperature for human comfort and agricultural productivity provided Apollo with an environment that matched his divine preferences throughout the year. The earliest detailed account of Apollo's Hyperborean connection appears in the home hymn to Apollo, where the god's birth on Dos establishes his immediate association with northern regions. According to this tradition, Leto sought refuge on the floating island of Delos to escape Hera's jealous persecution, and the island agreed to provide sanctuary in exchange for Apollo's promise to maintain his primary shrine there. However, the hymn also describes Apollo's immediate departure after his birth to establish connections with distant northern peoples who would provide ongoing support for his religious activities. This foundational myth establishes the principle that Apollo's divine authority extends far beyond the boundaries of the Greek world to encompass northern territories whose inhabitants possess special religious knowledge and devotion. Pindar's treatment of Apollo's Hyperborean relationship in his 10th Python Ode provides the most detailed classical description of the god's activities during his northern residence. According to the poet, Apollo spent his winter months participating in continuous festivals where the Hyperboreans demonstrate their perfect musical abilities and religious devotion. The god joins their choruses, accompanies their sacred dances with his lyre, and receives their offerings of perfect hecatombs that never include the blood sacrifice required by Mediterranean religious practices. Instead, the Hyperboreans honor Apollo with bloodless offerings of fruits, flowers, and musical performances that reflect their society's freedom from violence and death. The Hyperborean festivals described by Pindar involve elaborate musical competitions where the inhabitants demonstrate skills that surpass even the most accomplished Greek performers. Their lyres produce sounds of extraordinary purity and complexity, while their vocal harmonies achieve perfect mathematical proportions that reflect the cosmic order governing their realm. Apollo's participation in these performances represents not merely divine approval, but active collaboration as the god contributes his own musical abilities to create artistic achievements impossible in the ordinary world. These collaborative performances generate music that influences natural phenomena, causing flowers to bloom more abundantly and encouraging wild animals to gather peacefully around the festival sites. The legendary Hyperborean figures associated with Apollo worship extend beyond the anonymous masses of perfect citizens to include specific individuals whose names and accomplishments were preserved in classical sources. The most famous of these figures, Abaris the Hyperborean, appears throughout Greek literature as a wandering priest whose supernatural abilities derive directly from his northern origins and special relationship with Apollo. Classical authors describe Abaris as carrying a golden arrow given to him personally by Apollo during the god's residence in Hyperborea, an implement that serves simultaneously as a religious symbol, a means of magical transportation, and a tool for performing miraculous healings. Abaris allegedly possessed the ability to travel vast distances without consuming food, sustaining himself entirely through divine energy channeled through his sacred arrow. Greek cities throughout the Mediterranean reported visits from this remarkable individual during the 7th century BC when he appeared at moments of crisis to provide supernatural assistance and religious guidance. His interventions typically involved purification rituals that ended plague outbreaks, divination practices that predicted natural disasters, and religious reforms that improve relationships between human communities and divine powers. The consistency of these accounts across multiple independent sources suggests that some individual matching Aris's basic description did indeed travel throughout the Greek world, claiming Hyperborean origins and demonstrating unusual abilities. The golden arrow carried by Abaris receives detailed attention in classical sources, with various authors providing different explanations for its supernatural properties. Herodotus describes it as enabling rapid travel across enormous distances, while later sources suggest it served as a divination tool that revealed hidden knowledge about future events. Certain accounts claim the arrow contained fragments of meteoric iron that had fallen from the heavens into Hyperborean territory, materials that retain celestial properties, enabling communication with divine powers. The arrow's golden construction reflects Apollo's solar associations, while its aerodynamic form suggests connections to the god's role as an archer and sender of both beneficial and destructive projectiles. Archaeological evidence from Northern European sites dating to the Bronze and Iron Ages reveals religious practices that may have influenced Greek conceptions of Apollo worship and Hyperborean spirituality. Excavations throughout Scandinavia, northern Germany, and the Baltic regions have uncovered elaborate solar cult sites featuring stone circles, bronze discs, and ritual deposits that demonstrate sophisticated astronomical knowledge and sun worship practices. These installations suggest that Northern European peoples developed complex religious systems centered on solar deities centuries before documented Greek contact with these regions. The Nebra sky disk in Germany and dating to approximately 1600 BC provides particularly compelling evidence for advanced astronomical knowledge among Northern European populations. This bronze artifact displays sophisticated understanding of solar and lunar cycles, stellar positions, and seasonal changes that would have been essential for maintaining accurate religious calendars. The disk's symbolic representations include solar boats similar to those found in Scandinavian rock art, suggesting widespread distribution of solar religious concepts throughout Northern Europe during the Bronze Age. These archaeological discoveries indicate that Greek descriptions of Hyperborean astronomical and religious knowledge may have preserved accurate information about actual Northern European cultural achievements. Scandinavian rock art sites from the Bronze Age contain thousands of petroglyphs depicting solar symbols, ritual processions, and religious ceremonies that demonstrate the central importance of sun worship in Northern European cultures. The Tannum rock art complex in Sweden includes detailed scenes of priests conducting solar rituals, worshippers making offerings to celestial deities, and sacred boats carrying solar discs across symbolic waters. These artistic representations suggest that Northern European peoples maintained elaborate religious systems focused on solar deities whose characteristics parallel those attributed to Apollo and classical sources. The ritual deposits discovered at Northern European religious sites provide additional evidence for sophisticated religious practices that may have influenced Greek Apollo cults. Bog deposits throughout Denmark and northern Germany contain elaborate offerings, including bronze weapons, golden ornaments, and ritual vessels that demonstrate the wealth and artistic sophistication of Northern European religious communities. These offerings frequently include solar symbols, astronomical instruments, and musical instruments that parallel the religious equipment described in classical accounts of Hyperborean Apollo worship. The sacred offerings allegedly sent from Hyperborea to Mediterranean Apollo sanctuaries created a complex network of religious exchange that connected Northern European religious practices with Greek cult centers. Classical sources describe regular shipments of sacred materials that traveled from Hyperborean territories through elaborate transportation chains involving multiple intermediate peoples. These offerings included rare northern products such as amber, furs, and precious metals along with specially prepared religious items whose exact nature remained secret to all except the priests responsible for their handling. The amber trade routes that connected Northern European sources with Mediterranean markets provide a plausible framework for understanding how Hyperborean religious offerings might have reached Greek sanctuaries. Archaeological evidence demonstrates that amber from Baltic sources circulated throughout Bronze Age and Iron Age Europe, reaching Greek territories through established trade networks that involved multiple intermediate peoples. The religious significance attributed to amber in both Northern European and Greek cultures suggests that this material may have served as a medium for religious as well as commercial exchange. Greek sanctuaries, particularly those dedicated to Apollo, have yielded archaeological evidence for exotic northern materials that may represent the Hyperborean offerings described in classical sources. Excavations at Delhi have uncovered amber ornaments, unusual metal objects, and ritual implements that demonstrate contact with Northern European cultural traditions. While the specific identification of these materials as Hyperborean offerings remains speculative, Their presence at Apollo's primary shrine indicates that Northern European religious communities maintained some form of contact with Greek cult centers. The Gian records of Hyperborean embassies provide the most detailed classical accounts of how these religious exchanges operated in practice. According to Herodotus, the Dions maintained precise oral traditions describing the arrival of specific Hyperborean individuals who had brought sacred offerings to Apollo's birthplace shrine. These traditions included the personal names of Hyperborean women who had remained on Delos as permanent religious representatives, establishing ongoing connections between the northern realm and the Greek religious center. The two monuments erected for deceased Hyperborean representatives on Dos became focal points for local religious observances that continued for centuries after their construction. Delian women regularly visited these graves to make offerings and perform ritual hair-cutting ceremonies that honored the memory of the northern visitors. Young Gian men dedicated their first beard trimmings at these sites, creating coming-of-age rituals that incorporated Hyperborean religious elements into local Greek practices. These ongoing observances demonstrate the lasting impact of Hyperborean religious influence on Greek cult activities. The transportation system described for conveying Hyperborean offerings to Greek sanctuaries reveals sophisticated diplomatic arrangements that transcended normal political boundaries and ethnic conflicts. Each participating people understood their sacred obligation to maintain the religious connection between distant Hyperborea and Mediterranean Apollo shrines, suggesting widespread recognition of Hyperborean spiritual authority throughout Northern and Central Europe. The system's successful operation across multiple generations indicates that Northern European peoples maintained consistent religious practices and diplomatic relationships that enabled regular communication with Greek religious centers. Classical sources describe the Hyperborean offerings as wrapped in wheat straw according to ancient customs that preserve their sacred nature during the long journey southward. This packaging method suggests agricultural connections between Hyperborean religious practices and the grain cultivation that formed the foundation of Mediterranean economic life. The use of wheat straw as sacred wrapping material indicates that Hyperborean religious traditions incorporated agricultural symbolism similar to that found in Greek Dido and Apollo cults, creating additional theological connections between Northern and Southern European religious systems. The ritual objects allegedly included in Hyperborean offerings encompassed a wide range of materials and implements that reflected the sophisticated religious practices attributed to Northern European Apollo worshippers. Classical accounts mention golden ornaments crafted with extraordinary skill, musical instruments that produce sounds of unusual purity, and astronomical devices that demonstrated advanced knowledge of celestial movements. These descriptions suggest that Hyperborean religious communities possessed technological and artistic capabilities that impressed even the sophisticated craftsmen of classical Greek sanctuaries. The systematic attempts by ancient geographers to locate Hyperborea within the physical world reveal the complex interplay between inherited mythological traditions and emerging empirical knowledge that characterize classical geographical scholarship. Unlike the poetic treatments that presented Hyperboreas existing in a realm beyond normal spatial constraints, ancient crafters and geographical theorists faced the practical challenge of reconciling traditional accounts with observable geographical realities. Their efforts produced a diverse array of theoretical locations for the legendary Northern Realm, each reflecting different approaches to balancing literary authority against empirical observation. The earlier systematic geographical theories placed Hyperborea in the far northern regions of Saya, beyond the territories inhabited by the nomadic peoples known to Mediterranean Greeks through trade contacts and military expeditions. This positioning drew upon Herodotus' ethnographic investigations, which had established Saya as the northernmost region accessible to Greek knowledge, while acknowledging that vast, unknown territories extended further northward. Geographical theorists reasoned that if Hyperborea existed as a physical location, it must occupy these unmapped northern regions where harsh Scian winters might give way to the temperate conditions described in classical sources. The Scythian hypothesis gained credibility from reports provided by northern traders who described encountering peoples living under different climatic conditions in territories beyond the normal range of Scythian tribal movements. These accounts, filtered through multiple linguistic and cultural intermediaries, suggested that the harsh steppes gradually transitioned into more regions where permanent agricultural settlements became possible. Greek geographical theorists interpreted these fragmentary reports as potential evidence for Hyperborean territories, reasoning that the climatic improvements described by northern informants might correspond to the perpetual spring conditions attributed to the legendary realm. Archaeological evidence from Scythian territories provided additional support for theories placing Hyperborea in the northern steppes. Excavations of Scian burial sites revealed extensive collections of Greek manufactured goods, demonstrating regular trade relationships between Mediterranean civilizations and northern nomadic peoples. More significantly, these sites contained religious artifacts and artistic representations that suggested Scian familiarity with Apollo worship and solar religious symbolism. Greek geographical theorists argued that these religious connections indicated Scythian contact with Hyperborean Apollo worshippers, supporting theories that placed the legendary realm within accessible distance of known Scythian territories. However, more detailed investigation of Scythian geographical knowledge revealed significant problems with northern placement theories. Scythian informants consistently described the regions beyond their territories as becoming increasingly inhospitable rather than more temperate, contradicting fundamental Hyperborean characteristics. The nomadic peoples who ventured furthest northward reported encountering vast wilderness areas where extreme cold made permanent settlement impossible. While the few sedentary populations they encountered lived under harsh conditions that bore no resemblance to the abundance and comfort attributed to Hyperborean society. Alternative geographical theories emerged that placed Hyperborea in western rather than northern directions, identifying the legendary realm with territories beyond the Pillars of Heracles or in the distant Atlantic Ocean. These Western theories drew upon expanding Greek knowledge of Atlantic regions gained through Phoenician trade contacts and early Greek colonial expeditions beyond the Mediterranean basin. Geographical theorists noted that Western ocean currents and wind patterns might create climatic conditions different from those found in continental European territories, potentially supporting the temperate climate attributed to Hyperborean lands. The Western Atlantic hypothesis gained support from reports of islands discovered by Phoenician navigators during their exploration of Atlantic trade routes. These accounts described territories with favorable climates and abundant natural resources located at considerable distances from Mediterranean shores, characteristics that corresponded to traditional Hyperborean descriptions. Greek theorists reasoned that Hyperborea snorts might occupy one of these Atlantic islands, accessible only through dangerous ocean voyages that explained why direct Greek contact with the legendary realm remained limited to the religious exchange networks described in classical sources. Phoenician geographical knowledge transmitted to Greek scholars through commercial and diplomatic contacts included detailed information about Atlantic wind patterns, ocean currents, and seasonal weather variations that could potentially support Hyperborean climatic conditions. Phoenician navigators reported encountering regions where warm ocean currents moderated what would otherwise be harsh northern climates, creating islands of temperate weather within generally inhospitable maritime environments. Greek geographical theorists incorporated this information into revised Hyperborean location theories that placed the legendary realm on Atlantic islands warmed by favorable oceanic conditions. The British Isles emerged as another candidate location for Hyperborea as Greek geographical knowledge expanded through contact with Celtic peoples and Northern European trade networks. Reports from Greek colonies in southern France and Spain described large islands beyond Gaul inhabited by peoples possessing sophisticated religious traditions and advanced astronomical knowledge. These accounts noted that the northern islands enjoyed milder climates than their latitude would suggest due to maritime influences that moderated seasonal temperature variations. Greek theorists identified these climatic anomalies as potential evidence for Hyperborean conditions. Celtic religious practices observed by Greek traders and diplomats in Gaul and Britain demonstrated sophisticated solar worship traditions that paralleled the Apollo cult activities attributed to Hyperborean society. Celtic druids maintained elaborate astronomical calendars, conducted complex religious ceremonies involving musical performances and bloodless sacrifices, and claimed possession of prophetic abilities that resembled those associated with Hyperborean Apollo worship. These religious similarities led some Greek theorists to propose that Celtic territories, particularly the British Isles, might represent the actual location of a legendary Hyperborean realm. The identification of Hyperborea with British territories gained additional support from reports of unusual daylight patterns observed in northern European regions. Greek informants described territories where summer days lasted much longer than those experienced in Mediterranean climates, while winter nights extended for correspondingly longer periods. These extreme seasonal variations in daylight duration corresponded to classical descriptions of Hyperborean territories where the sun's behavior differed dramatically from normal Mediterranean patterns. Geographical theorists argued that these observed astronomical phenomena provided empirical evidence for locating Hyperborea in northern European territories. Atomic geographical treatises represent the most systematic classical attempts to map the northern boundaries of the inhabited world and establish precise locations for legendary territories mentioned in earlier sources. Claudius Ptolemy's geography, completed during the 2nd century AD, synthesized centuries of accumulated geographical knowledge into a comprehensive mathematical framework that attempted to assign specific coordinates to all known territories and peoples. His treatment of northern European regions reflects the challenges faced by ancient crafters attempting to reconcile traditional accounts with empirical observation and mathematical precision. Ptolemy's world map extended the inhabited regions significantly further northward than earlier geographical works, incorporating information gathered through Roman military campaigns, trade expeditions, and diplomatic contacts with Germanic and Celtic peoples. His northern boundaries encompassed territories that earlier Greek geographers had considered uninhabitable, reflecting expanded Roman knowledge of European geography gained through conquest and colonization. This northward expansion of the known world provided additional space for locating legendary territories like Hyperborea within the framework of empirical geographical knowledge. The Ptolemaic coordinate system assigned mathematical positions to various northern European peoples and territories based on astronomical observations and distance calculations derived from travel accounts. Germanic tribes, Celtic populations, and Scandinavian peoples received specific latitude and longitude coordinates that placed them within a rational geographical framework. However, Ptolemy's treatment of legendary territories remained ambiguous as he attempted to balance respect for classical literary authorities against the demands of mathematical precision and empirical verification. Ptolemy's discussion of the Rappan Mountains illustrates the complex relationship between mythological geography and empirical graphy in classical geographical works. Earlier sources had described these legendary mountains as forming the northern boundary of the inhabited world beyond, which lay the realm of perpetual winter dominated by Boreas. Some traditions placed Hyperborea beyond the Rappan range in territories protected from harsh northern winds by the mountain's barrier effect. Tomley attempts to reconcile these accounts with contemporary geographical knowledge by identifying the Riparian Mountains with actual mountain ranges observed in northern European territories. The geographical positioning of the Riparian Mountains in tomictography reflects attempts to create rational explanations for the climatic conditions attributed to Hyperborean territories. Classical climate theory recognized that mountain ranges could create significant variations in local weather patterns, with territories on the leeward side of major mountains often experiencing milder conditions than their latitude would suggest. Tommy geographers reasoned that if the Ripon Mountains existed as described in classical sources, they might create climatic conditions that could support the tempered environment attributed to Hyperborean lands. Ancient climate theories profoundly influenced geographical speculation about Hyperborean location by establishing theoretical frameworks for understanding how unusual climatic conditions might arise in specific geographical settings. Classical climatology divided the Earth into distinct zones based on solar heating patterns, with northern regions generally expected to experience harsh winters and limited agricultural productivity. However, ancient theorists recognized that local geographical features could create significant deviations from these general patterns, potentially producing isolated regions with climatic conditions that contradicted their geographical position. The concept of inhabitable zones played a crucial role in ancient geographical theories about Hyperborean location. Classical climate theory established that human civilization could only flourish within specific latitudinal bands, where solar heating provided adequate warmth for agriculture while avoiding the extreme heat that made southern regions uninhabitable. The northern boundary of the inhabitable zone was generally placed at latitudes where winter cold prevented reliable crop production, limiting human populations to nomadic lifestyles or seasonal settlements. However, ancient climatologists recognize that oceanic influences, mountain barriers, and other geographical factors could extend the inhabitable zone significantly beyond its normal boundaries in specific locations. Maritime climates moderated by warm ocean currents could support agricultural settlements at latitudes where continental climates would prove too harsh for permanent habitation. Similarly, territories protected by mountain ranges from cold northern winds might maintain temperate conditions despite their northern position. These theoretical possibilities provided frameworks for understanding how Hyperborean territories might exist within the physical world while maintaining their legendary climatic characteristics. The relationship between ocean currents and climate patterns received increasing attention from ancient geographical theorists as Mediterranean peoples expanded their knowledge of Atlantic regions. Reports from Phoenician and later Roman navigators described encountering warm ocean currents that significantly moderated the climate of northern Atlantic territories. These observations led to theoretical models suggesting that oceanic heating effects could create isolated regions of temperate climate within generally harsh northern environments. Ancient wind pattern theories provided additional frameworks for understanding how Hyperborean climatic conditions might arise in specific geographical locations. Classical meteorology recognized that prevailing wind directions significantly influence regional climate patterns, with territories receiving warm southern winds experiencing mild conditions than those exposed to cold northern airflows. Geographical theorists proposed that Hyperborean territories might occupy locations where favorable wind patterns or geographical barriers created protection from the harsh northern winds associated with Boreas. The theoretical relationship between Hyperborea and other mythical northern locations demonstrates the complex interconnections within classical geographical speculation about unknown territories. Thula, first described by the Greek explorer Pytheas during the 4th century BC, represented another legendary northern land, whose exact location remained disputed throughout antiquity. Some geographical theorists identified Thule with Hyperborea, arguing that both names referred to the same northern territory described through different cultural traditions. Others maintain that Tull and Hyperborea represented distinct locations, each possessing different characteristics and occupying separate positions within the northern geographical framework. Pytheas' account of his voyage to Tula provided the most detailed classical description of northern European territories based on direct observation rather than inherited traditions. His description of a land where summer nights lasted only 2 or 3 hours corresponded to astronomical conditions observable in northern Scandinavian territories, providing empirical evidence for the existence of inhabited regions at extreme northern latitudes. However, Pytheas' account also included descriptions of unusual natural phenomena, including seas that could neither be sailed nor walked upon that suggested encounters with geographical conditions unknown in Mediterranean regions. The identification of Pytheas' tool with various northern European territories influenced subsequent geographical theories about Hyperborean location. Some scholars identified Tool with Iceland, arguing that the island's geothermal features could create the temperate conditions attributed to legendary northern realms. Others placed Thursday in northern Scotland or Scandinavia, regions where extreme daylight variations matched Pytheas' astronomical observations. These competing identifications reflected the ongoing challenge faced by ancient geographers attempting to reconcile literary traditions with empirical geographical knowledge. The Rappan Mountains occupied a central position in ancient geographical theories about northern European topography and their relationship to legendary territories like Hyperborea. Classical sources consistently describe these mountains as forming a major geographical barrier that separated the known world from unknown northern regions. Some accounts placed the mountains beyond Scythian territories, while others located them within or adjacent to Scian lands. The exact position and characteristics of the Rappan Range remain subjects of ongoing geographical speculation throughout antiquity. Ancient descriptions of the Rappan Mountains emphasize their role as the source of major European rivers and the boundary between different climatic zones. Several classical authors described rivers flowing southward from the Rappan Range, including waterways that some sources identified with known European rivers such as the Tane or the Berestanes. These river systems provided potential transportation routes that could connect Hyperborean territories with the Mediterranean world through the religious exchange networks described in classical sources. The relationship between the Rappan Mountains and Hyperborean geography varied significantly among different ancient theories. Some geographical frameworks placed Hyperborea beyond the mountains in territories protected from harsh northern winds by the range's barrier effect. Others located Hyperborean territories within the mountain region itself, arguing that elevated locations might experience different climatic conditions than surrounding lowlands. Still, other theories identified the Rappan Range with a northern boundary of Hyperborean lands, suggesting that the legendary realm occupied the southern slopes of the mountains where favorable exposure created temperate microclimates. Archaeological investigations of northern European mountain regions have revealed evidence for sophisticated Bronze Age and Iron Age cultures that possessed advanced methodological skills, astronomical knowledge, and religious traditions involving solar worship. These discoveries suggest that ancient geographical theories about northern mountain peoples may have preserved accurate information about actual cultural achievements in regions that classical sources associated with legendary territories. The presence of advanced civilizations in northern European mountain regions provides potential support for geographical theories that placed Hyperborea or related legendary territories in such locations. The Roman encounter with Hyperborean traditions marked a fundamental shift in how classical civilization approached these northern legends, transforming them from purely Greek mythological concepts into practical tools for understanding and governing the expanding empire's northern territories. Roman authors approached Hyperborean material with a systematic methodology that characterized their treatment of inherited Greek learning. combining respect for classical authorities with pragmatic analysis based on contemporary military and administrative experience. This Roman perspective introduced new interpretive frameworks that connected legendary northern realms with actual Germanic and Celtic populations encountered during imperial expansion. Ovid's treatment of Hyperborea themes in his Metamorphoses demonstrates the sophisticated literary techniques Roman poets employed to adapt Greek mythological material for contemporary audiences. Writing during the Augustine period when Roman armies were actively campaigning beyond the Rhine and Danube frontiers, Ovid transformed traditional Hyperborean accounts into allegories that reflected Roman experiences with northern European peoples. His description of the eternal spring enjoyed by Hyperborean populations becomes a metaphor for the civilizing influence of Roman rule, suggesting that imperial administration could transform harsh barbarian territories into prosperous provinces resembling the legendary northern paradise. The poet's account of Apollo's winter residence among the Hyperboreans takes on new significance within the context of Roman imperial ideology. Ovid presents the gods' annual journey northward as a civilizing mission that brings Mediterranean cultural values to distant territories, paralleling the Roman belief that imperial expansion served to spread civilization throughout the barbarian world. The Hyperborean festivals described in Ovid's work emphasize themes of peaceful cultural exchange and voluntary submission to divine authority, reflecting Roman preferences for diplomatic solutions over military conquest in dealing with northern European tribes. Ovid's geographical references reveal familiarity with contemporary Roman knowledge of northern European territories gained through military campaigns and trade expeditions. His descriptions incorporate specific details about northern European landscapes, climate patterns, and natural resources that correspond to information available through Roman administrative sources. The poet's account of Hyperborean territory includes references to dense forests, navigable rivers, and mineral deposits that match Roman geographical knowledge of Germanic regions, suggesting that he deliberately connected legendary accounts with contemporary territorial realities. The transformation of Hyperborean religious practices in Ovid's account reflects Roman attempts to understand northern European religious traditions through classical interpretive frameworks. The poet describes Hyperborean Apollo worship in terms that correspond to Roman religious categories, emphasizing state-sponsored ceremonies, hierarchical priesthoods, and public festivals that maintain social order. This interpretation transforms the spontaneous musical celebrations described in earlier Greek sources into organized religious institutions that resemble Roman civic religious practices, making Hyperborean society appear more familiar and comprehensible to Roman audiences. Virgil's references to northern territories in the Aeneid demonstrate how Roman epic poetry incorporated Hyperborean themes into narratives celebrating imperial destiny and territorial expansion. The poet's description of Aunus's prophetic visions includes glimpses of future Roman conquests in northern regions where harsh climates would yield to Roman engineering and administration. Virgil's northern territories possess characteristics reminiscent of Hyperborean legends, suggesting that Roman rule could create conditions approaching mythological perfection, even in the most challenging geographical environments. The Georgics reveals Virgil's systematic approach to connecting legendary northern territories with practical agricultural and administrative knowledge. His discussion of northern European farming techniques, livestock management, and seasonal cycles incorporates information gathered through Roman contact with Germanic and Celtic agricultural communities. The poet describes methods for cultivating crops in northern climates, managing herds during extended winter seasons, and adapting Mediterranean agricultural practices to different environmental conditions. This practical information suggests that Roman administrators were actively studying northern European agricultural systems to improve imperial resource management. Virgil's treatment of northern European peoples emphasizes their potential for civilization under Roman guidance rather than their inherent barbarism. His descriptions of Germanic and Celtic communities acknowledge their military prowess, craft skills, and religious traditions while suggesting that these qualities could be channeled toward productive purposes through proper Roman administration. This perspective transforms traditional Roman attitudes toward barbarian peoples by presenting them as potential contributors to imperial prosperity rather than merely obstacles to territorial expansion. The poet's geographical descriptions incorporate contemporary Roman knowledge of northern European river systems, mountain ranges, and forest resources that have become strategically important for imperial defense and economic development. Virgil's references to the Rhine frontier, Danubian territories, and Transalpine regions reflect detailed familiarity with Roman military geography and administrative organization. His poetic treatment of these territories combines practical geographical information with mythological associations that connect contemporary Roman expansion with legendary accounts of northern realms. Tacitus represents the culmination of Roman historical analysis of northern European peoples and territories, providing systematic ethnographic accounts that explicitly connect contemporary Germanic and Celtic cultures with classical traditions about legendary northern realms. His Germania offers detailed descriptions of Germanic social organization, religious practices, military customs, and territorial arrangements based on information gathered through Roman diplomatic contacts, military campaigns, and administrative experience. This empirical approach to Northern European ethnography provides frameworks for evaluating the historical accuracy of earlier Hyperborean accounts. The historian's description of Germanic religious practices reveals sophisticated solar worship traditions that correspond closely to classical accounts of Hyperborean Apollo cult activities. Germanic communities maintained elaborate astronomical calendars, conducted seasonal festivals involving musical performances and communal celebrations, and preserved oral traditions describing divine connections with northern territories. Tacitus notes that Germanic priests possessed prophetic abilities similar to those attributed to Hyperborean religious specialists, suggesting continuity between legendary accounts and contemporary religious practices. Germanic social organization described by Tacitus includes democratic assemblies, consensual leadership selection, and peaceful conflict resolution mechanisms that parallel the harmonious governance attributed to Hyperborean society in classical sources. The historian notes that Germanic communities avoided the political violence and social inequality that characterized Mediterranean civilizations, instead maintaining stable social relationships based on mutual respect and shared religious values. These observations suggest that classical accounts of Hyperborean social perfection may have preserved accurate information about actual Northern European cultural achievements. Tacitus' geographical descriptions of Germanic territories emphasize their abundant natural resources, favorable agricultural conditions, and strategic locations that made them valuable additions to the Roman Empire. His account of Germanic lands includes detailed information about forest resources, mineral deposits, river transportation systems, and defensive positions that have become important considerations in Roman territorial planning. The historian's practical assessment of Germanic territorial value contrasts with earlier Roman dismissals of northern regions as worthless barbarian wastelands. The historian's analysis of Germanic military capabilities reveals sophisticated tactical systems, advanced metallurgical skills, and effective organizational structures that enable successful resistance to Roman expansion. Tacitus describes Germanic weapons, armor, and fortification techniques that incorporated advanced engineering principles and demonstrated familiarity with Mediterranean military innovations. His account suggests that Germanic peoples possessed technological capabilities that approached or exceeded Roman standards in specific areas, contradicting assumptions about barbarian technological inferiority. Roman administrative documents from northern frontier regions provide additional evidence for connections between classical Hyperborean traditions and actual Northern European cultural practices. Military reports, diplomatic correspondence. And provincial administrative records describe encounters with Germanic and Celtic communities that possess characteristics reminiscent of legendary northern realms. These official sources document northern European religious festivals, agricultural techniques, craft specializations, and social institutions that correspond to elements found in classical Hyperborean accounts. Archaeological evidence from Roman frontier installations reveals extensive cultural exchange between Roman administrators and northern European communities, including the adoption of northern religious practices by Roman military personnel stationed in Germanic territories. Excavations at Roman forts along the Rhine and Danube frontiers have uncovered religious artifacts, architectural modifications, and burial practices that demonstrate Roman integration of northern European spiritual traditions. These archaeological discoveries suggest that Roman encounters with northern European peoples produce significant cultural synthesis rather than simple military domination. The identification of specific northern European tribes with legendary Hyperborean populations appears in various Roman administrative and literary sources that attempt to connect contemporary territorial knowledge with inherited classical traditions. Roman authors propose that the Cimbri, Teutones, or other Germanic peoples might represent descendants of the legendary Hyperboreans, arguing that their religious practices, social organization, and geographical locations corresponded to classical descriptions. These identifications reflect Roman attempts to create historical continuity between mythological accounts and contemporary ethnographic knowledge. Roman religious syncretism in northern territories demonstrates systematic integration of Germanic and Celtic religious traditions with Mediterranean cult practices, creating hybrid religious systems that incorporated elements from both cultural traditions. Roman military installations in Germanic territories established shrines that combine traditional Roman religious forms with local northern European spiritual practices, including solar worship ceremonies that resembled classical descriptions of Hyperborean Apollo cult activities. These syncretic religious developments suggest that Roman administrators recognized value in northern European religious traditions rather than simply imposing Mediterranean practices. The adaptation of Roman religious calendars to accommodate northern European seasonal patterns reveals practical accommodation of local environmental conditions and cultural preferences. Roman administrative centers in Germanic territories modified traditional Mediterranean religious scheduling to correspond with northern agricultural cycles, seasonal celebrations, and astronomical observations that differed significantly from Mediterranean patterns. These calendar adaptations incorporated northern European knowledge of extended daylight variations, seasonal weather patterns, and agricultural timing that have been mentioned in classical Hyperborean accounts. Roman engineering projects in northern territories demonstrate systematic attempts to create environmental conditions resembling those attributed to legendary northern realms. Roman construction of heated buildings, covered markets, public baths, and agricultural installations in Germanic provinces aim to provide Mediterranean-style comfort and convenience despite harsh northern climates. These engineering achievements transformed northern European settlements in ways that approached the climatic perfection attributed to Hyperborean territories, suggesting that Roman technology could realize mythological ideals through practical application. The development of Roman trade networks connecting northern European territories with Mediterranean markets created economic relationships that resembled the religious exchange systems described in classical Hyperborean accounts. Roman merchants established regular transportation routes that carried northern European products including amber, furs, precious metals, and specialized craft goods to Mediterranean destinations. These trade networks operated through complex diplomatic arrangements involving multiple intermediate peoples, paralleling the elaborate transportation chains described for conveying Hyperborean religious offerings to Greek sanctuaries. Roman military recruitment in northern European territories incorporated Germanic and Celtic warriors into imperial armies, creating institutional frameworks for cultural exchange that transformed both Roman military practices and Northern European social organization. Germanic military techniques, weapons technology, and tactical innovations became integrated into Roman military systems, while Northern European recruits gained exposure to Mediterranean cultural values and administrative practices. This military integration created channels for transmitting Northern European cultural knowledge throughout the Roman Empire. The influence of Northern European legal traditions on Roman provincial administration demonstrates systematic Roman adaptation of local governance systems rather than simple imposition of Mediterranean legal frameworks. Roman administrators in Germanic territories incorporated elements of Germanic customary law, dispute resolution mechanisms, and social organization principles into provincial legal systems. These legal adaptations suggest that Roman authorities recognized the effectiveness of Northern European social institutions rather than dismissing them as primitive barbarian customs. Roman urban planning in Northern European provinces reflects systematic attempts to create settlements that combine Mediterranean urban amenities with adaptations to northern environmental conditions and cultural preferences. Roman cities established in Germanic territories incorporated architectural features, public spaces, and infrastructure systems designed to accommodate Northern European social patterns while providing Roman-style civic amenities. These urban developments created living environments that approach the idealized conditions attributed to Hyperborean cities and classical sources. The collapse of Roman imperial authority in Western Europe during the 5th century AD created profound disruptions in how classical knowledge was preserved, transmitted, and interpreted, fundamentally altering the medieval understanding of ancient traditions, including Hyperborean mythology. Christian chroniclers and theologians who inherited fragments of classical learning faced the complex task of reconciling pagan mythological accounts with Christian cosmological frameworks, producing innovative reinterpretations that transformed Hyperborean legends into components of medieval Christian geography and eschatology. These medieval adaptations demonstrate the sophisticated intellectual processes through which Christian scholars preserve classical knowledge while adapting it to serve contemporary religious and political purposes. The earliest Christian treatments of Hyperborean material appear in the works of late imperial church fathers who encountered classical, geographical, and mythological texts during their education in traditional Roman schools. Jerome's extensive correspondence reveals familiarity with Hyperborean references found in Virgil, Ovid, and other classical authors whose works remain standard components of late Roman educational curricula. However, Jerome approaches these mythological accounts with systematic skepticism, arguing that pagan poets had created fictional territories to glorify false gods and mislead believers away from Christian truth. His commentary on classical texts consistently reinterprets mythological geography as allegory, suggesting that legendary realms like Hyperborea represented spiritual rather than physical territories. Augustine's treatment of classical geographical knowledge in the City of God establishes interpretive frameworks that profoundly influenced medieval approaches to ancient mythological material. The bishop acknowledges that classical authors possessed accurate information about distant territories and peoples, but argues that their pagan religious perspectives prevented them from understanding the true spiritual significance of geographical phenomena. Augustine suggests that territories described in classical sources as possessing paradisial conditions might represent corrupted memories of Eden or prophetic visions of the celestial paradise promised to Christian believers. This interpretive approach transforms Hyperborean legends from pagan mythology into potential components of Christian salvation history. The preservation of classical texts in medieval monasteries created opportunities for Christian scholars to encounter detailed accounts of Hyperborean traditions while developing systematic approaches to reconciling pagan learning with Christian doctrine. Monastic libraries throughout Europe maintain copies of geographical works by Ptolemy Pliny and other classical authors whose treatments of northern territories included references to Hyperborean legends. Medieval librarians and copists preserved these texts not for their mythological content, but for their practical geographical information, which proved valuable for understanding the territories where Christian missionary activities were expanding during the early medieval period. Isidore of Seville's etymologies, completed during the early 7th century, represents the most systematic medieval attempt to synthesize classical geographical knowledge with Christian cosmological understanding. Isidore's treatment of northern European territories incorporates information derived from classical sources while reinterpreting legendary accounts within Christian frameworks that emphasize divine providence and moral instruction. His description of northern regions beyond Saya acknowledges classical references to territories possessing unusual climatic conditions, but attributes these phenomena to divine intervention rather than natural geographical processes or pagan religious influences. The bishop's geographical methodology demonstrates sophisticated techniques for extracting useful information from pagan sources while avoiding their problematic religious implications. Isidore systematically separates empirical geographical data from mythological interpretations, preserving classical knowledge about northern European peoples, territories, and natural phenomena, while rejecting explanations that involve pagan deities or supernatural forces. His account of northern regions includes detailed information about Germanic and Scandinavian peoples derived from classical ethnographic sources, but presents their cultural achievements as products of divine providence rather than pagan religious traditions. Isidore's treatment of the Rappan Mountains illustrates his approach to reconciling classical geographical accounts with Christian cosmology. Classical sources had described these legendary mountains as forming the northern boundary of the inhabited world beyond, which lay territories associated with Hyperborean legends. Isidore acknowledges the geographical reality of northern European mountain ranges while reinterpreting their significance within Christian frameworks that emphasize God's role in establishing natural boundaries and climatic zones. His account suggests that the Rappan Range represents a divinely created barrier that separates Christian territories from pagan lands where demonic influences remain powerful. The development of medieval graphy demonstrates systematic attempts to incorporate classical geographical knowledge into Christian world maps that emphasize religious rather than purely empirical geographical relationships. Medieval map makers preserved classical information about northern European territories while organizing their topographic presentations around Christian symbolic frameworks that place Jerusalem at the center of the inhabited world. These maps frequently included references to northern territories described in classical sources, but presented them as peripheral regions where Christian influence remained limited rather than as paradisial realms possessing special religious significance. The Hereford Mapundi, created during the late 13th century, exemplifies medieval approaches to incorporating classical geographical traditions into Christian topographic frameworks. The map includes references to northern European peoples and territories derived from classical sources, including regions that medieval scholars associated with Hyperborean traditions. However, these northern territories appear as marginal areas inhabited by monstrous peoples and supernatural beings, reflecting Christian reinterpretation of classical accounts that emphasize the spiritual dangers associated with pagan lands rather than their legendary perfection. Medieval chroniclers who documented the conversion of northern European peoples to Christianity frequently incorporated elements derived from classical Hyperborean traditions into their accounts of missionary activities and political transformations. These chroniclers recognized that northern European peoples possess sophisticated religious traditions and advanced cultural achievements that corresponded to characteristics attributed to legendary northern realms and classical sources. However, they interpreted these achievements as evidence of divine preparation for Christian conversion rather than as validation of pagan religious practices. A dam of Bremon's history of the archbishops of Hamburg Bremont completed during the 11th century provides detailed accounts of Scandinavian peoples and territories that explicitly connect contemporary observations with classical traditions about northern realms. Adam describes Scandinavian religious practices, social organization, and cultural achievements that closely parallel classical accounts of Hyperborean society, including sophisticated astronomical knowledge, elaborate musical traditions, and peaceful governance systems. However, he presents these characteristics as evidence of divine favor that prepared Scandinavian people for Christian conversion rather than as products of pagan religious excellence. The chronicler's description of Scandinavian religious practices reveals systematic attempts to identify Christian elements within pagan traditions while documenting the process of religious transformation, and notes that Scandinavian peoples maintained elaborate solar worship ceremonies that resembled classical descriptions of Hyperborean Apollo cult activities, but argues that these practices represented corrupted memories of original divine revelation rather than independent pagan achievements. His account suggests that Christian missionaries could build upon existing Scandinavian religious traditions while redirecting them toward proper Christian understanding. Adam's geographical descriptions of Scandinavian territories emphasize their abundant natural resources, favorable agricultural conditions, and strategic locations that made them valuable additions to the expanding Christian world. His account includes detailed information about Scandinavian forests, mineral deposits, maritime resources, and trade networks that corresponded to classical descriptions of northern territorial wealth. However, he attributes Scandinavian prosperity to divine providence rather than to the supernatural forces that classical sources associated with Hyperborean abundance. The preservation and transmission of classical texts through medieval manuscript traditions created complex processes of selection, interpretation, and adaptation that significantly influenced how Hyperborean material reached later medieval audiences. Byzantine scholars maintained more complete collections of classical geographical and mythological texts than their Western European counterparts, preserving detailed accounts of Hyperborean traditions that might otherwise have disappeared entirely. However, Byzantine copying practices frequently involved editorial modifications that adapted classical content to contemporary Christian sensibilities. Byzantine geographical compilations demonstrate systematic efforts to preserve classical knowledge while adapting it to serve contemporary political and religious purposes. The ethnic attributed to Stephanus of Byzantium preserves numerous classical references to Hyperborean traditions, but presents them within frameworks that emphasize their historical rather than religious significance. Byzantine editors frequently added commentary that explained classical mythological references in terms of historical allegory, suggesting that ancient poets had used fictional accounts to preserve memories of actual historical events and geographical realities. The transmission of classical texts through Islamic scholarly networks created additional opportunities for preserving and reinterpreting Hyperborean material during the medieval period. Islamic geographers and historians who translated classical Greek texts into Arabic encountered detailed accounts of northern European territories and peoples that included references to Hyperborean traditions. However, Islamic scholars approached this material with interpretive frameworks that differed significantly from both classical pagan and medieval Christian perspectives, creating unique adaptations that emphasized empirical geographical knowledge over mythological or religious interpretations. Al-Masudi's geographical works demonstrate Islamic approaches to classical northern European material that preserve detailed empirical information while rejecting both pagan mythological and Christian theological interpretations. His accounts of northern European peoples include information derived from classical sources about their religious practices, social organization, and territorial characteristics, but present these observations as ethnographic data rather than as evidence for supernatural phenomena or religious significance. This empirical approach preserved valuable classical information that might otherwise have been lost through Christian reinterpretation or neglect. The reintroduction of classical texts to Western Europe through Islamic scholarly networks during the 12th and 13th centuries created opportunities for medieval Christian scholars to encounter more complete versions of ancient geographical and mythological works than have been available through purely Christian manuscript traditions. These newly available texts included detailed accounts of Hyperborean traditions that had been preserved in Islamic libraries, but lost from Western European collections. However, the process of re-ransating these works from Arabic into Latin frequently involved additional interpretive modifications that further adapted classical content to medieval Christian frameworks. The development of medieval universities created institutional frameworks for systematic study of classical texts that included detailed analysis of geographical and mythological material. University scholars approached Hyperborean traditions with scholastic methodologies that emphasized logical analysis and systematic comparison of different sources rather than simple acceptance of inherited authorities. This academic approach produced more sophisticated understanding of the relationships between different classical accounts while maintaining Christian interpretive frameworks that emphasized moral and spiritual rather than literal geographical significance. Thomas Aquinas' treatment of classical geographical knowledge demonstrates scholastic approaches to reconciling ancient learning with Christian doctrine through systematic logical analysis. Aquinas acknowledges that classical authors possessed accurate empirical knowledge about distant territories and peoples, but argues that their pagan religious perspectives prevented them from understanding the true spiritual significance of geographical phenomena. His analysis suggests that territories described in classical sources as possessing paradisial conditions might represent natural geographical anomalies created by divine providence rather than supernatural realms governed by pagan deities. Medieval besties and geographical compilations frequently incorporated references to northern territories derived from classical Hyperborean traditions, but presented them within Christian symbolic frameworks that emphasized moral instruction rather than empirical geographical knowledge. These works described northern regions as inhabited by monstrous peoples and supernatural beings that represented spiritual dangers facing Christian travelers and missionaries. The transformation of classical Hyperborean paradise into medieval northern wasteland demonstrates the profound reinterpretation of inherited geographical traditions within Christian cosmological frameworks. The development of medieval pilgrimage literature created new contexts for understanding distant territories that influenced how scholars interpreted classical accounts of legendary northern realms. Medieval pilgrimage accounts emphasize the spiritual significance of geographical travel while documenting the practical challenges faced by Christian travelers in unfamiliar territories. These accounts frequently reference classical geographical knowledge while reinterpreting it within Christian frameworks that emphasize divine providence and spiritual instruction rather than empirical geographical accuracy. Medieval chronicles documenting the Crusades and other Christian military expeditions incorporated classical geographical knowledge about northern and eastern territories while adapting it to serve contemporary political and religious purposes. Crusade chroniclers frequently reference classical accounts of distant peoples and territories to provide historical context for contemporary military campaigns, but presented this information within Christian frameworks that emphasize the spiritual significance of territorial conquest and religious conversion. The emergence of medieval vernacular literature created new opportunities for adapting classical Hyperborean traditions to serve contemporary cultural and political purposes. Medieval Romance literature frequently incorporated elements derived from classical accounts of northern paradisia realms, but transformed them into Christian allegorical frameworks that emphasize spiritual rather than geographical significance. These literary adaptations demonstrate the continued cultural influence of classical Hyperborean traditions while illustrating their transformation within medieval Christian contexts. Medieval Arthurian literature reveals systematic incorporation of elements derived from classical Hyperborean traditions into Christian chivalry frameworks that emphasize moral instruction and spiritual development. Medieval Romance authors created northern territories possessing characteristics reminiscent of classical Hyperborean descriptions, including perpetual spring, abundant natural resources, and inhabitants possessing supernatural abilities. However, these literary territories served as settings for Christian moral instruction rather than as geographical realities or pagan religious centers. The development of medieval historical writing created systematic approaches to evaluating classical accounts of distant territories and peoples that influence how scholars interpreted Hyperborean traditions. Medieval historians developed methodological frameworks for distinguishing between reliable historical information and fictional or allegorical material in classical sources. These analytical approaches enabled more sophisticated understanding of the relationships between mythological accounts and historical realities, while maintaining Christian interpretive frameworks that emphasize spiritual rather than literal significance. Medieval missionary accounts from northern European territories provided contemporary observational data that could be compared with classical descriptions of northern peoples and their cultural characteristics. Christian missionaries working among Scandinavian, Germanic, and Slavic populations documented religious practices, social organization, and cultural achievements that corresponded to elements found in classical Hyperborean accounts. However, missionaries interpreted these observations as evidence of divine preparation for Christian conversion rather than as validation of pagan religious traditions or classical mythological accounts. The intellectual revolution that swept through 15th and 16th century Europe fundamentally transformed how scholars approached classical antiquity, creating unprecedented opportunities for rediscovering and reinterpreting ancient texts that had remained largely inaccessible during the medieval period. Renaissance humanists, driven by their passion for recovering authentic classical sources and their rejection of medieval scholastic interpretations, embarked on systematic campaigns to locate, translate, and analyze ancient manuscripts that had been preserved in monastic libraries, Byzantine collections, and Islamic scholarly centers. This philological revolution brought renewed attention to classical, geographical, and mythological texts that contained detailed accounts of Hyperborean traditions, enabling Renaissance scholars to encounter these ancient sources with fresh interpretive perspectives freed from medieval Christian allegorical frameworks. The rediscovery of complete manuscripts of Ptolemy's geography during the early 15th century provided Renaissance topographers and geographical theorists with detailed classical accounts of northern European territories that included systematic discussions of legendary realms like Hyperborea. Ptolemaic geographical coordinates and regional descriptions offered Renaissance scholars mathematical frameworks for analyzing ancient claims about northern territories while providing empirical standards for evaluating mythological accounts against observable geographical realities. Humanist scholars approached these newly available texts with methodological rigor that emphasized textual criticism, comparative analysis, and empirical verification rather than the allegorical interpretation that had characterized medieval treatments of classical sources. Marsilio Ficino's translations of Platonic and Neoplatonic texts introduced Renaissance scholars to sophisticated ancient philosophical frameworks for understanding the relationships between mythological accounts and metaphysical realities. Ficino's interpretation of Platonic geography suggested that legendary territories like Hyperborea might represent archetypal realms that existed within spiritual dimensions while maintaining connections to physical geographical locations. This Neoplatonic approach enabled Renaissance scholars to take classical Hyperborean accounts seriously as sources of genuine knowledge while avoiding literal geographical interpretations that contradicted contemporary empirical observations. The development of Renaissance printing technology revolutionized the dissemination of classical texts containing Hyperborean material, making detailed ancient sources available to scholars throughout Europe rather than limiting access to the few individuals who could examine rare manuscripts in monastic or university libraries. Aldus Manutius and other pioneering Renaissance publishers produced affordable editions of classical, geographical, and mythological works that enabled widespread scholarly engagement with ancient Hyperborean traditions. The printing revolution created scholarly communities that could engage in systematic comparative analysis of different classical sources while developing increasingly sophisticated interpretive methodologies. Giovanni Piccadilla Mirandella's approach to ancient wisdom traditions established influential frameworks for understanding how classical mythological accounts might preserve genuine knowledge about spiritual and natural realities despite their apparently fictional presentations. Pico's analysis of ancient theological and philosophical traditions suggested that pagan poets and philosophers had deliberately concealed profound truths within mythological narratives to protect sacred knowledge from profane misunderstanding. This interpretive approach encouraged Renaissance scholars to search for hidden meanings within classical Hyperborean accounts rather than dismissing them as mere poetic fiction or pagan superstition. The emergence of Renaissance natural philosophy created new contexts for evaluating classical claims about extraordinary natural phenomena associated with legendary territories like Hyperborea. Renaissance natural philosophers developed systematic approaches to investigating unusual climatic conditions, astronomical phenomena, and geographical anomalies that might correspond to characteristics attributed to mythical northern realms in classical sources. This empirical approach enabled scholars to separate potentially accurate observational data from obviously fictional elements within ancient accounts while maintaining openness to the possibility that classical authors had preserved genuine information about remarkable natural phenomena. Paracelsus and other Renaissance alchemical theorists incorporated classical Hyperborean traditions into their systematic investigations of natural forces and hidden properties of matter. Paracelian natural philosophy suggested that legendary territories like Hyperborea might represent regions where unusual astronomical influences or geological conditions created environments particularly favorable for alchemical processes and the manifestation of extraordinary natural phenomena. The critical framework enabled Renaissance alchemists to take classical accounts seriously while developing practical research programs aimed at discovering and utilizing the natural forces that might have created the remarkable conditions attributed to Hyperborean territories. The Renaissance fascination with Prisca Theologia, the ancient theological tradition that supposedly preceded and informed all historical religious systems, provided interpretive frameworks for understanding classical Hyperborean traditions as components of universal spiritual knowledge rather than merely Greek mythological inventions. Renaissance scholars like Agostino Stucco argued that ancient pagan traditions preserved authentic elements of original divine revelation that had been gradually corrupted through historical transmission. This perspective encouraged systematic analysis of Hyperborean religious practices described in classical sources as potential evidence for ancient spiritual traditions that might complement rather than contradict Christian theological understanding. Renaissance topographic projects undertaken by scholars like Sebastian Monster and Gerard Ismot demonstrated systematic attempts to reconcile classical geographical accounts with contemporary empirical knowledge gained through exploration and improved astronomical observation. These topographers incorporated classical references to northern territories while adapting them to accommodate new geographical discoveries and more accurate understanding of global spatial relationships. Renaissance maps frequently included territories derived from classical sources like Hyperborea, but positioned them within empirically grounded geographical frameworks that reflected contemporary knowledge of Northern European regions. The influence of classical Hyperborean traditions on Renaissance exploration narratives becomes particularly evident in accounts of northern voyages that explicitly referenced ancient sources while describing contemporary discoveries. Renaissance explorers and their chroniclers frequently compared newly encountered territories with classical descriptions of legendary northern realms, seeking to identify modern geographical locations that might correspond to ancient accounts. These comparative analyses influenced how Renaissance Europeans interpreted their encounters with northern peoples and territories, while providing frameworks for understanding the relationship between classical learning and contemporary empirical observation. Martin Frobisher's expeditions to the Arctic regions during the 1570s generated detailed accounts that explicitly referenced classical traditions about northern territories while documenting contemporary observations of Arctic conditions and indigenous populations. Frobisher's chroniclers compared the extreme daylight variations observed in Arctic regions with classical descriptions of northern territories where astronomical phenomena differed dramatically from Mediterranean patterns. These comparisons suggested that classical authors might have possessed accurate information about Arctic conditions despite their apparently mythological presentations of northern territories. The accounts of Frobisher's encounters with Inuit populations included systematic comparisons between indigenous Arctic cultures and classical descriptions of northern peoples found in Hyperborean traditions. Renaissance chroniclers noted that Arctic indigenous peoples possessed sophisticated knowledge of astronomical phenomena, maintained elaborate oral traditions about their territorial history, and demonstrated remarkable adaptation to harsh environmental conditions that enabled them to thrive in regions that would challenge Mediterranean populations. These observations encourage speculation that classical Hyperborean accounts might have preserved accurate ethnographic information about actual northern peoples despite their legendary presentations. Renaissance natural philosophers like John Dee incorporated classical Hyperborean traditions into their systematic investigations of mathematical and astronomical principles that govern natural phenomena. This analysis of ancient geographical and astronomical texts suggested that classical authors had possessed sophisticated understanding of mathematical relationships that influence climatic conditions, seasonal variations, and other natural phenomena associated with different geographical regions. His mathematical approach to classical sources encouraged systematic analysis of numerical relationships and astronomical data contained within ancient accounts of legendary territories. These topographic projects attempted to identify specific geographical locations that might correspond to classical descriptions of Hyperborean territories based on mathematical analysis of astronomical and climatic data. His calculations suggested that certain northern European or Arctic regions might experience unusual climatic conditions due to specific combinations of latitude, ocean currents, and seasonal astronomical variations that could produce environments resembling those described in classical sources. This mathematical approach enabled Renaissance scholars to take classical geographical claims seriously while subjecting them to empirical verification through contemporary observational data. The development of Renaissance occult philosophy created systematic frameworks for understanding how legendary territories like Hyperborea might exist within spiritual or astral dimensions while maintaining connections to physical geographical locations. Renaissance occultists like Heinrich Cornelius Agerer developed theories about multiple levels of reality that enabled classical mythological accounts to possess genuine truth value without requiring literal geographical interpretation. This metaphysical approach suggested that Hyperborean territories might exist as spiritual realities accessible through appropriate magical or contemplative practices rather than through ordinary physical travel. Agrippian occult geography proposed that legendary territories described in classical sources represented regions where spiritual forces manifested more directly within the physical world due to favorable astronomical influences or special geographical conditions. This theoretical framework suggested that classical accounts of Hyperborean paradise might describe actual locations where the boundary between spiritual and physical realms became more permeable, enabling inhabitants to experience conditions that transcended normal natural limitations. Renaissance occultists developed practical techniques for accessing these spiritual territories through ceremonial magic, contemplative practices, and astrological timing that corresponded to the astronomical conditions associated with legendary northern realms. The influence of Renaissance Hermeticism on geographical speculation created additional frameworks for understanding classical Hyperborean traditions as components of ancient wisdom traditions that preserved genuine knowledge about natural and spiritual realities. Hermetic philosophy suggested that ancient civilizations had possessed comprehensive understanding of natural forces and spiritual principles that enable them to create ideal social and environmental conditions resembling those described in classical accounts of legendary territories. This perspective encouraged Renaissance scholars to study classical sources as repositories of practical knowledge that might be recovered and applied to contemporary problems. Renaissance alchemical geography, influenced by Hermetic principles, proposed that certain geographical locations possessed unusual concentrations of spiritual forces or natural energies that created environments particularly favorable for human development and spiritual achievement. Alchemical theorists suggested that legendary territories like Hyperborea might represent regions where these favorable conditions existed naturally, enabling inhabitants to achieve levels of health, longevity, and spiritual development that exceeded normal human limitations. This theoretical framework encouraged systematic investigation of geographical factors that might influence human well-being and social development. The printing revolution's impact on disseminating classical Hyperborean literature extended beyond merely making ancient texts more widely available to include systematic scholarly commentary that developed increasingly sophisticated interpretive approaches. Renaissance editions of classical, geographical, and mythological works frequently included extensive annotations, comparative analyses, and critical discussions that demonstrated the intellectual frameworks Renaissance scholars brought to ancient sources. These scholarly commentaries reveal the complex processes through which humanist scholars adapted classical material to serve contemporary intellectual and cultural purposes. Erasmus' editorial work on classical texts established methodological standards for textual criticism that influenced how Renaissance scholars approached ancient accounts of legendary territories like Hyperborea. Erasmian philological methods emphasize the importance of comparing different manuscript traditions, analyzing linguistic variations, and understanding historical context that might have influenced how ancient authors presented their material. This rigorous textual criticism enabled Renaissance scholars to distinguish between authentic classical content and later medieval additions or modifications that might have altered original meanings. The development of Renaissance comparative mythology created systematic approaches to analyzing similarities between classical Hyperborean traditions and mythological accounts from other cultural traditions. Renaissance scholars noted that Northern European folklore, Celtic legendary traditions, and Germanic mythological accounts contained elements that corresponded to characteristics attributed to Hyperborean territories in classical sources. These comparative analyses suggested that classical Hyperborean accounts might have preserved memories of actual cultural exchanges between Mediterranean civilizations and Northern European peoples rather than representing purely fictional literary creations. Conrad Gessner's encyclopedic approach to natural history demonstrated systematic attempts to reconcile classical accounts of extraordinary natural phenomena with contemporary empirical observation and analysis. Gessner's treatment of northern European territories included detailed discussions of classical sources that described unusual climatic conditions, remarkable natural resources, and extraordinary wildlife associated with legendary northern realms. His scholarly methodology combined respect for classical authorities with empirical skepticism that required contemporary verification of ancient claims through direct observation or reliable contemporary testimony. The influence of Renaissance humanist scholarship on early modern crafty created systematic approaches to incorporating classical geographical knowledge into contemporary maps while adapting ancient sources to accommodate new discoveries and improved understanding of global spatial relationships. Renaissance crafters developed techniques for representing legendary territories derived from classical sources within empirically grounded geographical frameworks that reflected contemporary knowledge while acknowledging the historical and cultural significance of inherited traditions. Abraham Ortelius's Theaetum Orbisarum, published in 1570, exemplifies Renaissance approaches to synthesizing classical geographical traditions with contemporary empirical knowledge through systematic to graphic presentation. Ortelius included references to territories derived from classical sources while clearly distinguishing between empirically verified geographical information and traditional accounts that required further investigation. Histographic methodology demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the relationships between inherited learning and contemporary observation while maintaining scholarly respect for classical authorities. The development of Renaissance geographical literature created new genres that combined classical learning with contemporary exploration accounts, producing synthetic treatments that analyze the relationships between ancient sources and modern discoveries. These geographical compilations frequently included systematic discussions of classical Hyperborean traditions while evaluating their potential correspondence to contemporary knowledge of northern European and Arctic regions. Renaissance geographical authors developed analytical frameworks that enable them to extract potentially valuable information from classical sources while avoiding uncritical acceptance of obviously fictional elements. Richard Haeckel's compilation of exploration accounts demonstrates systematic attempts to connect contemporary northern voyages with classical traditions about northern territories, while maintaining empirical standards that distinguish between verified observations and speculative interpretations. Haeckel's editorial approach preserved classical references to legendary northern realms while emphasizing the importance of contemporary empirical verification through direct exploration and systematic observation. His geographical methodology influenced subsequent approaches to evaluating the relationships between inherited traditions and contemporary empirical knowledge. The emergence of Renaissance antiquarian scholarship created systematic approaches to investigating the historical foundations of classical mythological accounts through archaeological research, linguistic analysis, and comparative cultural studies. Renaissance antiquarians developed methodological frameworks for distinguishing between mythological elements and potentially accurate historical information within classical sources while maintaining scholarly respect for ancient learning. This antiquarian approach enabled more sophisticated understanding of how classical Hyperborean traditions might have originated and evolved through historical transmission. The intellectual transformation that swept across European scholarly circles during the 17th and 18th centuries fundamentally altered how learned men approached ancient traditions, including the persistent legends of Hyperborea. Enlightenment scholars armed with new methodological tools derived from empirical science and comparative analysis subjected classical sources to unprecedented scrutiny while developing systematic frameworks for distinguishing between historical kernels and mythological embellishments within inherited traditions. This rational revolution created the first truly critical examinations of Hyperborean material, producing scholarly debates that would establish the foundation for modern approaches to ancient mythology and historical geography. Francis Bacon's revolutionary approach to natural philosophy established methodological principles that profoundly influenced how Enlightenment scholars analyze classical accounts of extraordinary phenomena. Bacon's insistence on empirical verification and systematic observation provided frameworks for evaluating ancient claims about unusual geographical conditions, remarkable cultural achievements, and supernatural phenomena associated with legendary territories. His Nova Moranum outlined procedures for distinguishing between reliable observational data and speculative interpretations, creating analytical tools that scholars applied to classical Hyperborean accounts with unprecedented rigor. The Baconian emphasis on systematic comparison of multiple sources encouraged Enlightenment scholars to examine Hyperborean traditions alongside similar accounts from other cultural traditions, revealing patterns of mythological development that suggested common underlying processes rather than unique Greek inventions. Scholars noted that northern paradisal realms appeared in Celtic, Germanic, and Scandinavian traditions with characteristics remarkably similar to those attributed to classical Hyperborea, suggesting either widespread cultural diffusion or independent development of similar mythological concepts in response to comparable environmental and social conditions. Pierre Baylor's Historical and Critical Dictionary, published between 1695 and 1697, exemplified Enlightenment approaches to analyzing inherited traditions through systematic application of rational skepticism and comparative methodology. Bayle's treatment of classical, geographical, and mythological sources demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how ancient authors had combined observational data with speculative interpretations, creating complex texts that required careful analysis to separate potentially accurate information from obvious fictional elements. His critical examination of Hyperborean traditions established methodological standards that influenced subsequent scholarly investigation throughout the 18th century. Bayle's analysis revealed significant inconsistencies within classical accounts of Hyperborean geography, chronology, and cultural characteristics that suggested these traditions had evolved through multiple stages of literary development rather than preserving coherent memories of actual historical experiences. His systematic comparison of different classical sources demonstrated that ancient authors had frequently contradicted each other regarding fundamental aspects of Hyperborean society, indicating that these accounts reflected literary conventions rather than empirical geographical knowledge. This critical approach established frameworks for understanding how mythological traditions developed through processes of literary elaboration rather than historical transmission. The emergence of comparative philology during the early 18th century provided Enlightenment scholars with powerful tools for analyzing the linguistic relationships between different cultural traditions that contain similar mythological elements. Scholars like Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz developed systematic approaches to comparing mythological terminology across different Indo-European languages, revealing patterns of linguistic relationship that suggested common origins for apparently distinct cultural traditions. These philological investigations indicated that Hyperborean-type myths appeared throughout Northern European cultures with sufficient linguistic similarity to suggest either common inheritance from shared ancestral traditions or systematic cultural borrowing between related peoples. Leibniz's analysis of Northern European mythological terminology revealed that words associated with paradisiacal northern realms shared common etymological roots across Germanic, Celtic, and Scandinavian languages, suggesting that these traditions preserved memories of shared cultural experiences rather than representing independent literary inventions. His comparative linguistic research indicated that ancient Northern European peoples had maintained consistent conceptual frameworks for understanding ideal territorial conditions and perfect social organization, creating mythological traditions that classical Greek authors had encountered and adapted for Mediterranean audiences. The development of Enlightenment natural history created systematic frameworks for evaluating classical claims about extraordinary natural phenomena associated with legendary territories like Hyperborea. Natural historians like Gort Lullaire-Compon applied empirical methodologies to analyzing ancient accounts of unusual climatic conditions, remarkable biological phenomena, and extraordinary geological formations that classical sources associated with northern paradisal realms. This scientific approach enabled scholars to identify potentially accurate observational data within mythological accounts, while explaining apparently supernatural phenomena through natural causes. Buffon's systematic analysis of northern European climatic patterns revealed that specific geographical locations could indeed experience unusually temperate conditions despite their high latitudes, due to oceanic influences, geothermal activity, or favorable topographical arrangements that moderated harsh weather systems. His research suggested that classical accounts of perpetual spring in northern territories might have preserved accurate observations of actual geographical anomalies rather than representing purely fictional literary creations. This scientific validation of certain Hyperborean characteristics encouraged more nuanced approaches to evaluating mythological traditions that acknowledged the possibility of empirical foundations beneath legendary presentations. The systematic investigation of northern European archaeological sites during the 18th century provided unprecedented empirical evidence for evaluating classical claims about advanced northern civilizations that might have inspired Hyperborean traditions. Archaeological discoveries throughout Scandinavia, northern Germany, and the British Isles revealed sophisticated Bronze Age and Iron Age cultures that possessed advanced metallurgical skills, elaborate religious installations, and complex social organization systems that corresponded to characteristics attributed to legendary northern realms and classical sources. The excavation of megalithic monuments throughout northern Europe demonstrated that ancient northern peoples had possessed sophisticated astronomical knowledge and engineering capabilities that enabled them to construct elaborate religious installations requiring precise mathematical calculations and coordinated social organization. Sites like Stonehenge, New Grange, and the stone circles of Orne revealed that northern European cultures had developed complex religious systems centered on solar worship and astronomical observation centuries before documented classical contact with these regions. These archaeological discoveries provided empirical support for classical claims about advanced northern civilizations while suggesting natural explanations for the remarkable cultural achievements attributed to Hyperborean society. Voltaire's approach to analyzing historical traditions through rational criticism and systematic comparison established influential frameworks for distinguishing between potentially accurate historical information and obvious mythological embellishment within inherited sources. His essay on the manners and spirit of nations demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how cultural traditions evolved through processes of literary elaboration, political manipulation, and religious interpretation that could significantly alter original historical content. Voltaire's methodology encouraged systematic analysis of the social and political context that might have influenced how ancient authors presented their accounts of distant territories and peoples. Voltaire's examination of classical Hyperborean traditions revealed that these accounts served important political and cultural functions within Greek society that might have influenced how ancient authors presented their geographical and ethnographic information. He noted that idealized descriptions of northern territories frequently appeared during periods of political crisis or social upheaval in Greek cities, suggesting that Hyperborean traditions functioned as implicit criticisms of contemporary conditions rather than as straightforward geographical accounts. This political analysis provided frameworks for understanding how mythological traditions could preserve genuine cultural knowledge while serving contemporary ideological purposes. The systematic investigation of Northern European folk traditions during the 18th century revealed extensive similarities between classical Hyperborean accounts and indigenous Northern mythological traditions that suggested either direct cultural transmission or independent development of similar conceptual frameworks. Scholars like Jacob Grimm began documenting Germanic and Scandinavian folklore that contained detailed descriptions of northern paradisal realms possessing characteristics remarkably similar to those attributed to classical Hyperborea, including perpetual spring, abundant natural resources, and inhabitants possessing extraordinary longevity and wisdom. These folkloric investigations revealed that Northern European oral traditions had preserved detailed accounts of ideal territorial conditions and perfect social organization that paralleled classical Hyperborean descriptions with sufficient precision to suggest direct cultural relationship rather than coincidental similarity. The consistency of these folkloric elements across different Northern European cultural groups indicated that shared mythological concepts had maintained remarkable stability through centuries of oral transmission, suggesting that classical Hyperborean accounts might have preserved accurate information about actual Northern European cultural traditions rather than representing purely Greek literary inventions. David Hume's systematic analysis of historical evidence and mythological traditions established methodological principles that profoundly influenced Enlightenment approaches to evaluating extraordinary claims within inherited sources. Hume's emphasis on probabilistic reasoning and empirical verification provided frameworks for assessing the likelihood that classical accounts preserved accurate historical information versus representing literary fiction or religious propaganda. His analytical approach encouraged systematic examination of the evidence, supporting different interpretations of mythological traditions while maintaining appropriate skepticism about extraordinary claims that contradicted contemporary empirical knowledge. Hume's treatment of classical geographical accounts demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how ancient authors had combined observational data with speculative interpretation, creating complex texts that required careful analysis to distinguish between potentially reliable information and obvious fictional elements. His examination of Hyperborean traditions revealed that these accounts contained internal inconsistencies and logical problems that suggested literary rather than empirical origins, while acknowledging that certain elements might preserve accurate observations about actual Northern European conditions or cultural practices. The development of Enlightenment ethnographic methodology created systematic approaches to comparing different cultural traditions that enabled scholars to identify patterns of mythological development and cultural transmission across different societies. Ethnographic researchers like Joseph Francois Lafito developed comparative frameworks for analyzing similar mythological elements found in different cultural contexts, revealing processes of cultural diffusion and independent development that helped explain the widespread distribution of Hyperborean-type myths throughout Northern European and other cultural traditions. Lafito's comparative analysis revealed that paradisal Northern realm myths appeared in cultural traditions throughout the Northern Hemisphere with sufficient similarity to suggest either common origins or systematic cultural borrowing between related peoples. His research indicated that these mythological concepts served important social functions within different cultural contexts, providing frameworks for understanding ideal social organization, perfect environmental conditions, and harmonious relationships between human communities and natural forces. This functional analysis suggested that Hyperborean traditions reflected universal human aspirations rather than preserving memories of specific historical experiences. The systematic investigation of ancient trade routes during the 18th century provided empirical frameworks for understanding how cultural information and mythological traditions might have been transmitted between Mediterranean civilizations and Northern European peoples. Archaeological evidence for extensive Bronze Age and Iron Age trade networks connecting northern European amber sources with Mediterranean markets demonstrated that regular cultural contact had existed between these regions centuries before the classical period when Hyperborean traditions first appeared in Greek literature. These trade route investigations revealed that amber, furs, precious metals, and other Northern European products had circulated throughout Mediterranean markets through complex transportation networks that involved multiple intermediate peoples and extended over vast geographical distances. The systematic nature of these trade relationships suggested that cultural information, including mythological traditions and religious practices, have been transmitted alongside commercial goods, creating opportunities for Mediterranean peoples to encounter detailed accounts of Northern European cultural achievements and territorial conditions. Johann Gottfried Herder's approach to analyzing cultural traditions through historical and linguistic investigation established influential frameworks for understanding how mythological accounts might preserve genuine cultural knowledge despite their apparently fictional presentations. Herd's emphasis on the historical development of cultural concepts encouraged systematic examination of how mythological traditions evolved through processes of cultural transmission, literary adaptation, and social interpretation that could significantly alter original content while preserving essential elements. Herd's analysis of Northern European cultural traditions revealed that these societies had maintained sophisticated oral traditions that preserved detailed historical knowledge, religious practices, and territorial information through systematic processes of cultural transmission that ensured remarkable consistency across multiple generations. His research suggested that classical Hyperborean accounts might have preserved accurate information about actual Northern European cultural achievements that Greek authors had encountered through trade contacts or diplomatic relationships. Even though this information had been adapted to serve Mediterranean literary and political purposes, the emergence of systematic archaeological methodology during the late 18th century provided unprecedented empirical evidence for evaluating classical claims about advanced ancient civilizations in Northern European territories. Archaeological investigations revealed that Northern European peoples had developed sophisticated metallurgical techniques, elaborate religious installations, and complex social organization systems during the Bronze Age and Iron Age periods that corresponded to cultural achievements attributed to Hyperborean society and classical sources. The discovery of advanced astronomical instruments, precise mathematical calculations embedded in megalithic monuments, and sophisticated artistic traditions throughout Northern European archaeological sites demonstrated that ancient Northern peoples had possessed technological and intellectual capabilities that approached or exceeded those found in contemporary Mediterranean civilizations. These archaeological discoveries provided empirical support for classical claims about remarkable Northern cultural achievements, while suggesting that Hyperborean traditions might have preserved accurate information about actual historical societies rather than representing purely mythological inventions. The systematic analysis of classical sources through comparative textual criticism revealed that ancient authors had frequently incorporated information derived from multiple sources when constructing their accounts of distant territories and peoples. Scholars noted that detailed geographical descriptions, ethnographic observations, and cultural information found in classical Hyperborean accounts often corresponded to empirical data that could be verified through contemporary investigation, suggesting that ancient authors had access to reliable informants who possessed direct knowledge of Northern European conditions and cultural practices. This textual analysis indicated that classical Hyperborean traditions represented complex synthesis of observational data, cultural interpretation, and literary elaboration rather than simple fictional inventions or pure mythological speculation. The presence of verifiable empirical information within these accounts suggested that ancient Mediterranean peoples had maintained more extensive knowledge of Northern European territories and peoples than previous scholars had recognized, creating possibilities for recovering genuine historical information through careful analysis of mythological sources. The development of Enlightenment theories about cultural diffusion and historical development provided systematic frameworks for understanding how advanced civilizations might have emerged in northern European territories and subsequently influenced Mediterranean cultural development. Scholars propose that northern European peoples might have developed sophisticated cultural achievements independently of Mediterranean influence, creating advanced societies that could have served as models for the idealized civilizations described in classical Hyperborean accounts. These diffusionist theories suggested that cultural achievements traditionally attributed to Mediterranean civilizations might have originated in northern European contexts and subsequently spread southward through trade contacts and cultural exchange networks. This theoretical framework encouraged systematic investigation of northern European archaeological evidence while providing alternative explanations for the remarkable cultural achievements attributed to legendary northern realms and classical sources. The revolutionary archaeological discoveries of the 19th and 20th centuries fundamentally transformed scholarly understanding of ancient northern European civilizations, providing unprecedented empirical evidence that challenged traditional assumptions about the cultural sophistication of pre-Roman northern peoples. Heinrich Schliemann's pioneering excavations at Troy during the 1870s established methodological precedents for systematic archaeological investigation that subsequent researchers applied to northern European sites with remarkable results. The meticulous documentation techniques developed by German and Scandinavian archaeologists revealed complex Bronze Age and Iron Age societies throughout northern Europe that possessed technological capabilities, artistic achievements, and social organization systems far more advanced than classical sources had suggested. The excavation of a Nebra sky disk in 1999 near Nebra, Germany, provided concrete evidence for sophisticated astronomical knowledge among Bronze Age Central European populations dating to approximately 1600 BC. This bronze artifact, measuring 32 centimeters in diameter and weighing over 2 kilograms, displays intricate astronomical symbols, including solar and lunar representations, stellar configurations, and seasonal markers that demonstrate advanced understanding of celestial mechanics. The disk's sophisticated design incorporates gold inlays depicting the sun, moon, and star clusters arranged according to precise astronomical calculations that would have enabled accurate prediction of seasonal changes and agricultural timing. Chemical analysis of the bronze composition revealed that the raw materials originated from multiple European sources, indicating extensive trade networks and technological cooperation between distant Bronze Age communities. The discovery of the Trondheim Sun Chariot in Denmark during 1902 revealed additional evidence for elaborate solar worship practices among Scandinavian Bronze Age populations. This remarkable bronze sculpture dating to approximately 1400 BC depicts a horse-drawn chariot carrying a large golden disc representing the sun across the heavens. The artifact's sophisticated metallurgical construction required advanced casting techniques and precise mathematical calculations to achieve the proper proportional relationships between its various components. Archaeological analysis revealed that the sun chariot was deliberately deposited in a bog as part of religious ceremonies, suggesting that Bronze Age Scandinavian peoples maintained elaborate ritual practices centered on solar deities whose characteristics paralleled those attributed to Apollo in classical Hyperborean accounts. Systematic excavation of megalithic monuments throughout northern Europe during the 20th century provided extensive evidence for advanced astronomical knowledge and engineering capabilities among Neolithic and Bronze Age populations. The investigation of Stonehenge revealed that this massive stone circle was constructed according to precise astronomical alignments that enabled accurate prediction of solar and lunar cycles across multiple centuries. Radiocarbon dating indicated that construction began around 3100 BC and continued through multiple phases until approximately 1600 BC, demonstrating sustained cultural continuity and accumulated technical knowledge across numerous generations. The monument's massive trilithons required sophisticated engineering techniques and coordinated social organization involving hundreds of workers over extended periods. The New Grange Passage tomb in Ireland, constructed around 3200 BC, demonstrates even more remarkable astronomical precision in its design and orientation. Archaeological investigation revealed that the monument's entrance passage and burial chamber were aligned with mathematical precision to admit sunlight only during the winter solstice sunrise, creating dramatic illumination effects that would have possessed profound religious significance for its builders. The structure's corbelled roof, constructed without mortar, has remained watertight for over 5 millennia, demonstrating engineering capabilities that rival modern construction techniques. Detailed analysis of the monument's decorative carvings revealed sophisticated geometric patterns and astronomical symbols that suggest advanced mathematical knowledge among its Neolithic builders. The excavation of Bronze Age burial sites throughout Scandinavia revealed extensive evidence for sophisticated metallurgical techniques and international trade relationships that connected northern European populations with Mediterranean and Near Eastern civilizations. The Burum Eshoge burial mounds in Denmark, dating to approximately 1400 BC, contained remarkably preserved organic materials, including woolen textiles, leather garments, and wooden artifacts that demonstrated advanced craft specialization and artistic sophistication. Chemical analysis of bronze artifacts found in these burials revealed that the copper originated from alpine sources, while the tin came from Cornwall, indicating trade networks spanning the entire European continent. The discovery of the Echtgirl burial in Denmark provided unprecedented insights into Bronze Age Scandinavian social organization and cultural practices. This remarkably preserved burial dating to approximately 1370 BC contained the remains of a young woman wearing elaborate woolen clothing decorated with bronze ornaments and accompanied by grave goods indicating high social status. Isotope analysis of her teeth and hair revealed that she had traveled extensively throughout Europe during her lifetime, suggesting that Bronze Age Scandinavian elites maintained regular contact with distant civilizations through established diplomatic or trade relationships. The burial's elaborate construction and rich grave goods indicated that Bronze Age Scandinavian societies possessed sufficient wealth and social stratification to support aristocratic classes comparable to those described in classical accounts of Hyperborean society. Archaeological investigation of Iron Age Scandinavian religious sites revealed extensive evidence for elaborate ceremonial complexes that possess characteristics remarkably similar to those attributed to Hyperborean religious practices and classical sources. The Upper Kra archaeological site in southern Sweden, occupied continuously from the 1st century BC through the 10th century AD, contained numerous buildings dedicated to religious ceremonies, craft production, and elite residential activities. Excavations revealed extensive deposits of sacrificial offerings, including weapons, jewelry, and agricultural products that demonstrated the site's importance as a regional religious center. The presence of Roman imports alongside locally produced luxury goods indicated that Iron Age Scandinavian religious communities maintained regular contact with Mediterranean civilizations while preserving distinctive Northern European cultural traditions. The discovery of bog bodies throughout Northern Europe provided dramatic evidence for sophisticated preservation techniques and elaborate ritual practices among Iron Age populations. The Tolen Man, discovered in Denmark in 1950, was so remarkably preserved that archaeologists initially mistook him for a recent murder victim. Detailed forensic analysis revealed that this individual, who died around 400 BC, had been ritually strangled and deposited in the bog as part of religious ceremonies. The man's peaceful facial expression and carefully arranged body position suggested that he had been a willing participant in ritual sacrifice rather than a victim of violence. Similar bog body discoveries throughout Denmark, Germany, and the Netherlands indicated that Iron Age Northern European peoples maintained consistent religious practices involving human sacrifice and ritual deposition over extended periods. The systematic investigation of Germanic and Celtic hill forts revealed sophisticated defensive installations and urban planning that demonstrated advanced military engineering and social organization among Iron Age Northern European populations. The Hunterberg Hill Fort in southwestern Germany, occupied during the 6th and 7th centuries BC, contained elaborate fortification systems constructed using Mediterranean architectural techniques alongside traditional Northern European building methods. Archaeological evidence revealed that the site's inhabitants maintained regular trade contact with Greek colonies while developing distinctive local cultural traditions that combined Mediterranean influences with indigenous Northern European elements. Comparative mythology studies initiated during the late 19th century by scholars like Max Muller revealed systematic patterns of mythological development across Indo-European cultures that suggested common origins for apparently distinct legendary traditions. Muller's analysis of solar mythology demonstrated that Northern European cultures possessed elaborate mythological systems centered on solar deities whose characteristics closely parallel those attributed to Apollo in classical Hyperborean accounts. Germanic, Celtic, and Scandinavian mythological traditions consistently described northern paradisiacal realms where solid deities resided during winter months, creating mythological frameworks remarkably similar to classical descriptions of Apollo's Hyperborean sojourn. The linguistic analysis of Indo-European mythological terminology revealed extensive shared vocabulary relating to northern paradisiacal realms across different cultural traditions. Comparative philological research demonstrated that Germanic, Celtic, Slavic, and Baltic languages preserve common roots for words describing ideal territorial conditions, perfect social organization, and divine connections with northern regions. These linguistic similarities suggested either common inheritance from shared ancestral traditions or systematic cultural borrowing between related peoples over extended periods. The consistency of these mythological concepts across different Indo-European cultures indicated that Northern European peoples had maintained remarkably stable cultural traditions that preserved detailed knowledge about ideal social and environmental conditions. The systematic documentation of Northern European folk traditions during the 19th and 20th centuries revealed extensive oral literature that preserved detailed accounts of northern paradisiacal realms possessing characteristics virtually identical to those attributed to classical Hyperborea. The Brothers Grimm's collection of Germanic folktales included numerous stories describing northern territories where perpetual spring prevailed, inhabitants enjoyed extraordinary longevity, and social harmony eliminated conflict and suffering. These folkloric accounts maintained remarkable consistency with classical Hyperborean descriptions despite having been transmitted through independent oral traditions for over a millennium. Scandinavian folklore collected by scholars like Asbjørnsen and M.O. contained elaborate descriptions of northern realms inhabited by divine beings who possess characteristics closely paralleling those attributed to Hyperborean populations in classical sources. These folklore traditions described northern territories accessible only through dangerous journeys across hostile wilderness areas, where travelers encountered societies possessing advanced technological capabilities, sophisticated artistic traditions, and harmonious social organization. The persistence of these folkloric elements across different Scandinavian cultural groups suggested that Northern European oral traditions had preserved accurate memories of advanced ancient civilizations despite centuries of cultural transformation. Modern climatological researchers provided crucial insights into the paleoclimatic conditions that prevailed in northern Europe during the periods when Hyperborean traditions allegedly originated. Ice core analysis from Greenland glaciers reveal detailed records of temperature and precipitation patterns extending back over 100,000 years, enabling precise reconstruction of climatic conditions during the Bronze Age and Iron Age periods when advanced northern European civilizations flourished. These paleoclimatic data indicated that northern Europe experienced significantly warmer and more stable climatic conditions between approximately 2000 BC and 500 BC than those that prevailed during subsequent historical periods. The medieval warm period documented through multiple paleoclimatic indicators, including tree ring analysis, ice core data, and sedimentary deposits demonstrated that northern European regions experienced unusually temperate conditions between approximately 900 and 300 AD. During this period, agricultural settlements extended significantly further north than their modern limits, while Greenland supported substantial Norse colonies that maintained regular contact with European markets. Archaeological evidence from these Norse settlements revealed sophisticated agricultural techniques and architectural adaptations that enabled comfortable living conditions despite the challenging Arctic environment. Paleobotanical research conducted throughout northern European bog deposits and lake sediments provided detailed evidence for vegetation patterns that prevailed during ancient periods when advanced northern civilizations flourished. Pollen analysis revealed that extensive deciduous forests dominated northern European landscapes during the Bronze Age and early Iron Age, creating environmental conditions significantly more favorable for human settlement than those that characterized later historical periods. These warmer climatic conditions would have supported the agricultural abundance and comfortable living conditions attributed to Hyperborean society and classical sources. The analysis of ancient tree ring patterns from preserved bog oaks throughout northern Europe revealed evidence for remarkably stable climatic conditions during the Bronze Age that would have enabled consistent agricultural production and sustained population growth. Dendrochronological data indicated that northern European regions experienced fewer climatic extremes and more predictable seasonal patterns during this period than those documented in subsequent historical records. These favorable environmental conditions would have provided the foundation for developing the advanced civilizations and cultural achievements that classical sources associated with Hyperborean territories. Contemporary scholarly consensus regarding the historical value of Hyperborean literature reflects sophisticated understanding of how mythological traditions can preserve genuine cultural knowledge despite their apparently fictional presentations. Modern anthropologists recognize that oral traditions frequently maintain remarkable accuracy when transmitting information about geographical conditions, cultural practices, and historical events across multiple generations. This recognition has encouraged systematic analysis of classical Hyperborean accounts as potential sources of empirical information about ancient northern European civilizations rather than dismissing them as pure literary fiction. The development of ethnoarchaeological methodology has provided frameworks for understanding how advanced ancient civilizations might have developed in northern European contexts without leaving extensive material remains that would survive in the archaeological record. Ethnographic studies of circumpolar peoples demonstrate that sophisticated cultural achievements, including advanced astronomical knowledge, elaborate artistic traditions, and complex social organization, can flourish in northern environments without requiring the monumental architecture and extensive material culture that characterizes Mediterranean civilizations. This recognition suggests that classical accounts of advanced Hyperborean civilization might preserve accurate information about northern European cultural achievements that would not necessarily be preserved in archaeological contexts. Modern archaeological theory acknowledges that traditional approaches to investigating ancient civilizations have frequently underestimated the cultural sophistication of peoples who did not construct monumental architecture or develop extensive urban centers. The recognition that complex societies can flourish without creating the material signatures that archaeologists traditionally associate with advanced civilization has encouraged more nuanced approaches to evaluating classical accounts of legendary territories like Hyperborea. Contemporary scholars increasingly recognize that mythological traditions may preserve accurate information about cultural achievements and social organization systems that would not necessarily survive in the archaeological record. The systematic investigation of circumpolar archaeological sites during the 20th and 21st centuries has revealed extensive evidence for sophisticated cultural traditions throughout the Arctic regions that possess characteristics corresponding to those attributed to Hyperborean society and classical sources. Archaeological sites throughout Alaska, northern Canada, Greenland, and Siberia have yielded evidence for advanced technological capabilities, elaborate artistic traditions, and complex social organization among ancient Arctic populations. These discoveries suggest that northern circumpolar regions supported advanced civilizations that might have served as models for the idealized societies described in classical Hyperborean accounts. The Dorset and Thule cultures of the North American Arctic developed sophisticated technologies for surviving and thriving in extreme northern environments, including advanced hunting techniques, elaborate artistic traditions, and complex social organization systems that enabled successful adaptation to challenging climatic conditions. Archaeological evidence reveals that these Arctic peoples possessed detailed astronomical knowledge, maintained extensive trade networks spanning thousands of kilometers, and developed artistic traditions of remarkable sophistication and beauty. The cultural achievements of these Arctic civilizations demonstrate that northern regions could indeed support the advanced societies described in classical Hyperborean traditions. Recent archaeological discoveries in Siberia have revealed evidence for advanced Bronze Age and Iron Age civilizations that possess technological capabilities and cultural achievements comparable to those attributed to Hyperborean society. The Scion archaeological sites throughout the Siberian steppes have yielded elaborate burial complexes containing sophisticated metal work, intricate textiles, and artistic objects demonstrating remarkable technical skill and aesthetic sophistication. These Siberian civilizations maintained extensive trade relationships, connecting northern Asian populations with Mediterranean and Near Eastern markets, creating possibilities for cultural exchange that might have transmitted information about northern territorial conditions and cultural achievements to classical Mediterranean authors. The systematic investigation of circumpolar archaeological sites during the 20th and 21st centuries has revealed extensive evidence for sophisticated cultural traditions throughout the Arctic regions that possess characteristics corresponding to those attributed to Hyperborean society and classical sources. Archaeological sites throughout Alaska, northern Canada, Greenland, and Siberia have yielded evidence for advanced technological capabilities, elaborate artistic traditions, and complex social organization among ancient Arctic populations. These discoveries suggest that northern circumpar regions supported advanced civilizations that might have served as models for the idealized societies described in classical Hyperborean accounts. The analysis of modern literature reveals how Hyperborean mythology has profoundly influenced literary movements from Romanticism through contemporary fantasy fiction. The Romantic poets of the late 18th and early 19th centuries found in Hyperborean imagery a powerful symbol for their rejection of industrial civilization and their yearning for pristine natural environments uncorrupted by mechanization. Samuel Taylor Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner draws heavily upon northern mythological traditions, creating haunting landscapes that echo classical descriptions of territories beyond normal geographical boundaries. The poem's supernatural elements and extreme northern setting reflect romantic fascination with regions where natural laws might operate differently than in familiar European environments. Lord Byron's treatment of northern themes in works like Childe Harold's Pilgrimage demonstrates how romantic authors adapted classical Hyperborean imagery to express their disillusionment with contemporary European society. Byron's descriptions of northern landscapes emphasize their sublime terror and otherworldly beauty, creating poetic environments that serve as refuge from the moral corruption and political violence that characterized early 19th century Europe. The poet's northern territories possess the eternal spring and harmonious social conditions attributed to classical Hyperborea, but transformed into romantic frameworks that emphasize individual spiritual experience rather than collective social perfection. The German Romantic movement produced particularly sophisticated adaptations of Hyperborean themes through authors like Nahles and Friedrich Hölderlin, who incorporated northern mythological elements into philosophical frameworks that emphasize the relationship between nature and consciousness. Nahles' fragmentary novel Heinrich von Oeferdingen includes descriptions of northern realms where poetry and music possess magical powers that transform physical reality, creating environments that parallel classical accounts of Hyperborean artistic achievements. The author's mystical approach to northern mythology reflects German Romantic theories about the unity of art, nature, and spiritual experience that found powerful expression through adapted classical imagery. The Victorian fascination with Arctic exploration created new literary contexts for Hyperborean themes, as authors like Jules Verne and H. Rider Haggard incorporated northern mythological elements into adventure narratives that reflected contemporary geographical discoveries. Verne's The Adventures of Captain Hatteras presents the Arctic as a region where extraordinary natural phenomena create conditions approaching those described in classical accounts of northern paradise. The novel's descriptions of geothermal valleys, unusual wildlife, and indigenous peoples possessing advanced cultural traditions demonstrate how Victorian authors adapted Hyperborean imagery to accommodate contemporary scientific knowledge while preserving the essential mystery and wonder associated with northern territories. The emergence of fantasy literature during the 20th century provided new frameworks for exploring Hyperborean themes through authors who explicitly acknowledged their debt to classical sources while creating original fictional worlds that incorporated northern mythological elements. Robert E. Howard's Conan stories frequently reference Hyperborea as an ancient civilization that possessed advanced magical and technological capabilities before disappearing into legendary obscurity. Howard's Hyperborean kingdoms combine classical descriptions of northern paradise with pulp fiction elements that emphasize adventure and conflict, creating popular literary frameworks that introduced Hyperborean mythology to mass audiences throughout the English-speaking world. J.R.R. Tolkien's Middle-earth legendarium demonstrates sophisticated integration of Northern European mythological traditions, including elements derived from classical Hyperborean accounts, into comprehensive fictional cosmologies that preserve the essential characteristics of ancient sources while adapting them for contemporary readers. Tolkien's Valinor possesses many characteristics attributed to classical Hyperborea, including perpetual spring, divine inhabitants, and freedom from death and suffering. The philologist's academic background enabled him to incorporate authentic mythological elements while creating original narratives that captured the spiritual significance of ancient northern traditions for modern audiences. The ongoing study of Hyperborean traditions demonstrates their enduring significance as windows into ancient cultural exchange, mythological development, and the human imagination's capacity to create powerful symbols that transcend their AUS original historical contexts. From their origins in ancient Greek literature through their modern manifestations in popular culture and scholarly research, these northern legends continue to provide valuable insights into how societies create and maintain cultural meaning across historical boundaries. The persistence of Hyperborean imagery throughout different historical periods and cultural contexts reveals fundamental human concerns about ideal social organization, perfect environmental conditions, and harmonious relationships between human communities and divine forces. The scholarly consensus that has emerged from centuries of investigation acknowledges that Hyperborean traditions represent complex synthesis of empirical observation, cultural interpretation, and mythological imagination rather than simple fictional inventions or historical records. This understanding enables contemporary researchers to extract valuable information about ancient Northern European societies while recognizing the literary and cultural processes that shaped how this information was preserved and transmitted. The continued study of these traditions provides ongoing opportunities for understanding the relationships between mythology and history, the processes of cultural transmission, and the enduring human fascination with territories that exist beyond the boundaries of ordinary experience. The legacy of Hyperborea in contemporary culture demonstrates the remarkable persistence of mythological traditions that continue to provide meaningful frameworks for understanding human relationships with environment, society, and transcendence. Whether encountered through scholarly analysis, literary adaptation, or popular entertainment, these ancient northern legends continue to offer powerful imagery for exploring contemporary concerns while preserving connections to the cultural achievements of ancient civilizations. The ongoing vitality of Hyperborean traditions in modern contexts suggests that these mythological frameworks address fundamental aspects of human experience that transcend specific historical periods or cultural boundaries, ensuring their continued relevance for future generations seeking to understand the complex relationships between imagination, history, and cultural meaning.